Winter in medieval Scandinavia wasn't a season, it was an authority figure, a judge, a warden, a celestial landlord whose only rule was pay your suffering on time. And the moment the last scraps of autumn warmth drifted away like a Viking ship disappearing into fog, you knew your lease with the sun had officially expired. The sky dimmed, the temperature dropped, and suddenly, congratulations, you were living inside a snow globe someone kept shaking. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. To modern ears, winter sounds festive. Gingerbread, soft blankets, warm drinks, the kind of cold that feels like a personality trait rather than a threat. Medieval Scandinavians would simply stare at you and wonder why your first instinct isn't to dig a shelter. Because here, winter arrived not with a whisper, but with a long, unbroken stretch of darkness and cold so deep that even your thoughts felt a little frozen. Before you can even decide whether this is survivable, the darkness punches first. In some regions, the sun practically files for temporary resignation, dipping below the horizon for weeks. Dawn and dusk felt like rumours. Time didn't move so much as shiver. Imagine waking up and not knowing if it's morning or night, because it's both and neither. And also it doesn't matter, because everything is dark anyway. Winter didn't politely knock, it barged in, rearranged the furniture, and then sat on your chest. The cold was its accomplice. Not brisk cold, not grab a jacket cold, no, this was cold that wanted a relationship with you. Intimate, clingy, the kind that seeped into your bones with the emotional commitment of a long-term partner and refused to leave even when you begged. If you stepped outside without layers of wool thick enough to double as medieval armour, you weren't uncomfortable. You were courting frostbite with the enthusiasm of someone who had completely given up. Wind was another problem. Scandinavian winter wind didn't blow. It interrogated. It sliced across open land, through forests, along fjords, and straight through any garment that wasn't properly prepared. A gust could rearrange your world view. It didn't matter whether you were hauling firewood, trying to check your livestock, or simply existing outdoors for more than 30 seconds. The wind treated everyone equally, and by equally I mean horribly. And snow? Didn't fall gently. It accumulated aggressively. What began as a powdery nuisance transformed into waist-deep drift that swallowed fences, tools, and occasionally the neighbour's child. Paths disappeared overnight. Even the farm buildings, designed to withstand centuries of storms, would groan under the sheer weight. Medieval Scandinavians developed a very personal relationship with their roofs, because if they didn't maintain them, the roofs would simply come inside uninvited. But here's where medieval life complicates things. Winter wasn't just an environmental problem, it was a scheduling problem. You had months of cold darkness, but the chores, they did not care. Winter offered no breaks and no leniency. You still had to fetch water, tend to livestock, gather firewood, maintain tools, and try desperately not to freeze while doing any of these. The climate wasn't merely hostile, it was demanding. Survival was a full-time job with overtime, no pay, and the constant possibility that the workplace, your farm, would collapse under snow. Even so, medieval Scandinavians learned to work with the season rather than against it. They observed winds, understood snowfall patterns, tracked the sky, and recognized the subtle signals nature offered. They knew exactly when storms would strike, when the cold would deepen, and when the brief, precious moments of clear weather would allow them to repair something before the next disaster arrived. Their survival wasn't luck, it was deep knowledge of a world that modern people rarely experience. But even with that expertise, winter remained the tyrant. You could prepare all you wanted, winter would still find creative ways to challenge you. A sudden freeze after a thaw turned every outdoor surface into a skating rink designed by someone who clearly disliked you. An unexpected blizzard could erase 3 weeks of carefully shoveled paths. Heavy snow might damage your storage, threatening the food supply you were relying on for the next half year. Winter had range. Winter had creativity. Winter had time. The psychological weight was just as serious. With long nights, relentless storms, and constant labour, many people found their moods sinking into something colder than the climate itself. Winter created fjords, thick, suffocating scents broken only by wind, cracking ice, or animals complaining louder than you ever dared. Children grew restless. Adults grew irritable. You had no room, no privacy, and no escape except the occasional moment when you stepped outside and hoped the fresh air wouldn't kill you. And yet, despite all this, medieval Scandinavians endured it with stubborn resilience. They accepted winter not as a villain, but as a fact of life, a monumental force you didn't argue with. You endured, you adapted, you outlasted it. Compared to other Europeans, they were basically the original champions of cold weather survival, experts at making do in conditions that would send modern people into immediate emotional collapse. But make no mistake, winter always won the opening round. The only question was whether you could make it to spring for the rematch. And remember, the good news, you survived summer. The bad news, winter noticed. If you imagine a medieval Scandinavian farm as a rustic, peaceful retreat surrounded by snowy beauty, please throw that image directly into the nearest fire. In reality, your farm wasn't a cosy countryside home. It was your first, last, and only line of defence against nature, hunger, weather, and occasionally your own livestock. Calling it a farm was generous. More accurately, it was a collection of buildings clinging to a patch of land the climate had not yet killed. To begin with, isolation wasn't a feature. It was the entire package. Your nearest neighbour might be a long walk away, longer in winter, when paths vanished under snow and distances stretched by the simple inconvenience of freezing wind hitting your face every 3 seconds. Villages existed, yes, but many farms were stand-alone outposts scattered across fjords, valleys, mountainsides, and forests. Each household was its own kingdom, its own workforce, and its own emergency response team. If something broke, you fixed it. If someone got hurt, you handled it. If wolves came too close, you dealt with it. Your farm was less pastoral charm and more self-sufficient fortress where the walls were made of necessity. The layout of the farm reflected this reality. The longhouse, or sometimes multiple smaller structures, didn't follow any aesthetic rules beyond keep us alive. Buildings were placed close together, not for convenience, but so you wouldn't have to wander too far into the freezing dark to feed animals or fetch tools. Every step outdoors was risk calculation. The shorter the walk, the fewer opportunities for winter to negotiate your early exit from life. Paths between structures were worn tight and narrow, partly from use and partly because snowdrifts didn't negotiate evenly. The longhouse itself served multiple purposes. Living space doubled as workspace, eating area, storage area, and in some cases, a temporary barn for the coldest nights. Walls were thick, but not luxurious. Every surface was functional, shelves for tools, racks for drying, corners for storing equipment that you were definitely going to need later, even if you didn't know when. The doorway was small and low, not because medieval Scandinavians enjoyed head trauma, but because it kept the cold out. Comfort was not the priority. You weren't building a home for relaxation. You were building a structure that resisted wind, snow, wild animals, storms, and time. Outside, the land was divided with equal practicality. Fields were not arranged for symmetry. They followed the contours of the land, using every patch that wasn't swamp, rock, sheer cliff, or outright useless. Medieval farming in Scandinavia was an act of negotiation with the earth. You took what little fertile soil you could find, you nurtured it, you prayed over it, you occasionally yelled at it, and even then, the land gave you only what it felt like giving, nothing more, but the farm's layout extended beyond fields and buildings. It included the forest, the hills, the grazing areas, and access routes that you used seasonally. For much of the year, you herded animals into mountain pastures or forest clearings, places that allowed the farm to survive without overusing the limited land around the homestead. In winter, that changed completely. You consolidated everything inward. The animals were brought closer. The tools were brought closer. Your responsibilities stacked around you like a maze, each task essential for getting through the long months ahead. And then there were the boundaries, fences, ditches, stone markers. They weren't picturesque, they were functional, designed to keep animals from wandering off into the snowy wilderness or slipping into freezing water. If a cow disappeared into the forest in summer, you could find it. If it disappeared in winter, you could kiss that investment goodbye. Good fences weren't good neighbours, they were survival infrastructure. What often surprised outsiders was how deliberately Scandinavian farms were designed to be mini ecosystems. You grew what you could, collected what you could, hunted when possible, and gathered from the forest when needed. Nothing was wasted, nothing was decorative. If a structure existed, it had a purpose. If it didn't have a purpose, it didn't exist. People didn't build gazebos, they built smokehouses, they built storage lofts, they built sheds where onions, herbs, ropes, hides, blades, and spare parts hung like a chaotic but efficient inventory system. Inside the farm boundaries, every single object was a tool for survival, or part of the machinery of daily life. Even the placement of the manure pile mattered. Yes, your manure had strategic value. Properly located, it froze slower, stayed contained, and could enrich the fields later. Poorly placed, and it froze solid into an unmovable mountain of misery that mocked you every time you walked past it. Then there was the silence, the deep rural silence that winter amplified, until your farm felt like the only inhabited spot in 100 miles. The wind, the distant crack of ice, the restless shuffling of animals, these became the soundtrack of your existence. There were no city bells, no distant market chatter, no passing travellers during winter. Just you, your household, your animals, and the knowledge that if anything went wrong, reinforcements were not coming. This isolation shaped how people lived. You had to know every corner of your land, every weak spot in your buildings, every tool that needed repair, every animal's habits. You didn't have the luxury of ignoring problems. The farm wasn't a home in the modern sense. It was a system, a machine, and you were one of the moving parts. If you stopped functioning, the entire system collapsed. So yes, your farm was a home, but more importantly, it was a survival experiment carefully constructed from wood, earth, grit, and a deep understanding that winter was always watching. After all, this isn't a homestead, it's a cold-weather test chamber. If you lived as a medieval Scandinavian farmer, your personality wasn't defined by your hobbies, your charm, or your conversational skills. It was defined by whether you could keep food edible for 6 months without it turning into mould, dust, or a snack for something with sharp teeth. Forget bravery. Forget honour. Winter didn't care how heroic you were. Winter cared whether you had enough food not to collapse halfway through February. Food storage wasn't just a chore, it was the backbone of survival, the metric by which responsible adults were judged, and the quiet dread that sat at the back of your mind from harvest until the moment you opened the storage loft in spring. Your entire life revolved around the question, has the food held up? Please, for the love of all Norse gods, let the food have held up. Let's begin with grain, your most precious resource and your winter-long emotional support system. Barley, oats, rye, these weren't ingredients, they were life. Grain decided whether you made bread, porridge, ale, or absolutely nothing. So you protected it like treasure. The storage loft, often built above the living area or as a standalone granary, was your holy sanctuary. Its walls were made thick, elevated from the ground, sealed against rodents, and reinforced by a combination of carpentry and pure terror. Every bag of grain you put away in autumn represented hours of labour, ploughing, sowing, weeding, harvesting, drying, threshing. Losing even a portion wasn't just inconvenient, it was catastrophic. Mice didn't nibble grain, they stole from your future. A leak in the granary didn't make the grain damp, it murdered your caloric expectations. Mould wasn't a problem, it was the beginning of a famine. The grain wasn't stored casually, it was portioned, arranged, checked, rechecked, and occasionally whispered to like a beloved but fragile child. Grain that looked suspicious was set aside. Grain that smelled wrong was discarded. Grain that softened or clumped meant sleepless nights. There was no room for denial, no room for hope-based management. If your grain failed, everything else failed with it. But grain alone couldn't get you through winter, not unless you wanted to experience malnutrition with a side of despair. You needed protein, fat, and variety. Enter the real champions of Scandinavian winter survival: smoked meat and dried fish. Let's start with fish, because medieval Scandinavia was practically made of it. Herring, cod, salmon, trout. If it swam, you caught it, cleaned it, salted it, and hung it to dry. Drying fish wasn't just a chore, it was a commitment. The fillies hung outside in cold, dry air for days or weeks, undergoing a transformation from something you'd serve fresh into something you could use to build a small house if necessary. Dried fish lasted forever. It didn't spoil, it didn't rot. It didn't care if winter tried to ruin it. It became a block of edible wood with excellent longevity and questionable flavour, and you were grateful for it. Dried fish was dependable. It was the friend who always showed up, even if you didn't fully enjoy their company. Then there was smoked meat, the culinary equivalent of a security blanket. Pork, mutton, goat, even horse in a pinch. If you could smoke it, you saved it. Smokehouses were essential structures, not luxuries. Small enclosed buildings where slabs of meat hung from rafters, while slow-burning fires preserved them for the long haul. The entire process took patience, skill, and the willingness to spend hours choking on smoke before your eyes adjusted. Smoked meat wasn't tender, it wasn't juicy, it wasn't delicately seasoned. But what it lacked in romance, it made up for in reliability. When everything else froze, failed, or vanished beneath snowdrifts, smoked meat remained. And you cherished every hard, salty, chewy bite because the alternative was not biting anything at all. The storage of all this wasn't a simple matter of sack it and forget it. Food had enemies, countless enemies. Rodents, insects, moisture, mold, rot, theft, both human and animal, and the unforgiving march of time. You checked your stores constantly. You listened to walls for scratching sounds. You evaluated every scent. You monitored humidity without knowing the word humidity. You became fluent in the language of decay. Food storage shaped the rhythms of your household. You rationed carefully, calculating how much to consume each week, adjusting when winter storms lasted longer than expected. If an animal fell ill and required extra feed, you reevaluated your winter allotments. If early frost destroyed part of the autumn harvest, you braced yourself months in advance for inevitable hardship. Food storage also shaped your social behaviour. Hospitality existed, yes, but it came with math. Sharing too much threatened your family's survival. Sharing too little threatened your reputation. This balance wasn't moral, it was logistical. You didn't invite friends for dinner. You evaluated whether you could afford to hand them a bowl of porridge without shortening your own lifespan. And the psychological weight? Immense. Food stores weren't just supplies, they were hope, safety, insurance. Every time you opened the storage loft and saw well-packed grain, orderly smoke-blackened meat and rows of dried fish, you felt a flicker of comfort. You were going to make it, probably, hopefully. So when someone asked, "What's for dinner?" the answer wasn't a dish. The answer was survival. Because out here, in the deep Scandinavian winter, you didn't ask what you were eating. You asked if dinner still existed. In medieval Scandinavia, the soil was not your friend. It tolerated you at best, resented you at worst, and occasionally punished you out of sheer spite. When people today say farming is tough, they usually mean the tomatoes didn't grow right or the basil died. But for a medieval Scandinavian farmer, a failed crop wasn't an inconvenience. It was a countdown. When the harvest went wrong, there was no mystery, no suspense, or you already knew your winter was about to be a slow-motion farewell tour. Crops were the foundation of everything: your meals, your livestock fee, your brewing barrels, your trade, and your sense of stability. And unlike today, when your missing groceries can be fixed with one trip to a store, you had absolutely no backup, no imports, No trade caravan showing up with fresh grain. No neighbouring regions with surplus. The climate was too harsh, the land too limited, and the distances too great. When your own fields betrayed you, the universe politely whispered, "Good luck." The growing season was short, which meant every single week mattered. Spring didn't gently settle in. It arrived late, awkward, and occasionally snow-covered. Plant too early, and frost destroyed everything. Plant too late, and the crops didn't mature. It was a narrow window, the botanical equivalent of threading a needle while blindfolded during a storm. One miscalculation, and nature didn't forgive. Weather was your first enemy. Rain? You needed some, but not too much. Sun? Essential, but unpredictable. A sudden cold snap in midsummer could stunt growth. A heavy storm could flatten grain in minutes. Hail wasn't just unpleasant. It was crop-denting, harvest-ending artillery. Too little rain meant shriveled stalks. Too much meant soggy, mould-prone fields. You watched the sky as if it owed you money. Then there were pests, birds, insects, rodents. Everything wanted a share of your already fragile yield. A flock of hungry birds could strip a field faster than you could shout at them. Worms that tunneled into roots didn't just damage plants, they sliced your winter food supply. Medieval Scandinavians didn't have pesticides or controlled environments. They had shouting sticks and hope. The soil itself was another unpredictable collaborator. Scandinavian farmland was scattered across patches of workable earth between mountains, forests, and wetlands. It was rarely deep, rarely uniform, and often exhausted quickly. Crop rotation wasn't a modern invention, it was a survival tactic. If you planted the same thing repeatedly, the soil simply gave up and refused to provide. And unlike in warmer climates where year-round agriculture could restore nutrients through time and variety, Scandinavian soil had one chance each year to perform. Just one. Disease could wipe out entire sections of crops, and medieval farmers didn't have names for these illnesses, just despair. When plants yellowed, curled, or blackened, you understood the message even if you didn't understand the science. You were doomed. And then there were the wildlife hazards. Moose, deer, and boar weren't charming woodland creatures. They were walking stomachs capable of undoing weeks of labour in a single night. A moose stepping into your field wasn't a majestic moment. It was a catastrophe with antlers. If it ate your barley, you didn't lose some crops. You lost meals, ale ingredients, and animal feed. Fencing slowed them down, but big animals treated fences like minor suggestions. The emotional tension of waiting for harvest was tremendous. Every week you checked the fields. Every day you tried to gauge whether the stalks were growing properly. Every night you prayed, literally prayed, that nothing unexpected would happen. A farmer's confidence wasn't tied to courage or strength, it was tied to whether the grain stalks looked slightly healthier than yesterday. When harvest time finally arrived, it wasn't a celebration. It was a test, a confrontation. You walked into the fields knowing the question wasn't, will we have enough? It was, do we at least have enough to not die? And when the answer was no, everything changed. A poor harvest meant rationing from day one. No feasting, no celebration. You measured meals in handfuls. You hid food from animals, from neighbours, from anything with a pulse. You stretched what you had, hoping spring would arrive sooner than usual, or that you could fish or hunt enough to compensate. A very bad harvest. That meant winter wouldn't simply be difficult, it would be predatory. You'd lose livestock because there wouldn't be enough feed. You'd lose your strength because you wouldn't have enough calories. And you'd lose people, quietly, slowly, inevitably. Medieval Scandinavia didn't sugarcoat starvation. It didn't romanticize endurance. If the harvest failed, entire households felt it like gravity getting heavier. And the scariest part? It didn't take a dramatic disaster to ruin everything. You didn't need a biblical plague or a Viking war or a fire that consumed half the region. Sometimes all it took was 2 weeks of bad weather at exactly the wrong time. Harvest failure didn't care about fairness. It didn't care about effort. It didn't care that you had children, elderly family members, or responsibilities. Nature didn't negotiate. You worked with what you got, or you didn't survive. Because in this world, bravery didn't keep you alive. A full granary did. Miss that one harvest and winter didn't just arrive uninvited. It came with an obituary already written, with your name neatly filled in. In medieval Scandinavia, livestock weren't animals. They weren't pets. They weren't even resources in the way we think of them today. They were living treasure chests, four-legged banks that paid interest in milk, warmth, manure, wool, traction, and occasionally meat. If your farm burned down, you mourned. If a cow died, you held a funeral in your heart and considered wearing mourning clothes. Winter might take you, but losing livestock could take your entire future. Let's start with cows, because in medieval Scandinavia, cows were the aristocrats of the barnyard. A cow wasn't simply a creature. You measured your wealth, your security, and your long-term prospects by how many of them you could keep alive through winter. A single cow produced more than milk. She produced butter, cheese, cream, leverage in trade, and options. Real, tangible options. If hunger stalked your household, a cow could be the difference between barely scraping by and absolute disaster. But the irony, killing the cow for meat was almost always the worst choice. That was like burning your furniture was to stay warm for one night. Comforting briefly, catastrophic long-term. You didn't eat the cow unless everything else had gone sideways, and you were one bad week away from using your shoes as soup ingredients. A living cow gave you months, years of value. A dead one gave you one feast and long-term regret. Medieval people weren't sentimental, but they were practical. So yes, if winter rationing got tight, the cow stayed. You, however, were advised to rethink your portion sizes. Sheep were the silent workhorses of the farm, small fluffy animals whose purpose in life wasn't cuteness but utility. Wool wasn't just clothing, it was insulation, protection, a barrier between your fragile, freezing body and the world outside. A sheep kept you alive, literally woven into your winter survival gear. And unlike crops, which could fail spectacularly for any number of reasons, sheep reliably turned grass into wool year after year. Their milk mattered too. Sheep's milk, richer than cow's milk, became soft cheeses and sometimes emergency nutrition during the leaner months. And when a sheep was finally slaughtered, usually only when old, lame, or as the last resort, you gained meat, fat, hide and bones. Nothing went to waste. Even the intestines had jobs. If you had a flock that kept producing wool and lambs, you weren't just surviving, you were building wealth. Goats were the clever, mischievous survivors of the animal world. If a cow was a bank account and a sheep was an insurance policy, a goat was the scrappy side hustle that never failed. Goats thrived in landscapes where other animals struggled. Rocky slopes, no problem. Scrubby brush, delicious. Weather that discouraged humans from going outside. Goats barely noticed. Their milk was versatile, their temperament was energetic, and their ability to find food bordered on supernatural. A goat could eat a plant that looked inedible and produce milk that kept children and adults alive. In hard winters, goats were the morale boosters of the barn, stubborn, lively, and always available to remind you that someone on the farm was still enjoying life. Now, keeping livestock alive wasn't as simple as locking them in a warm room and hoping for the best. These animals required a strategic, near-military level of planning. You needed to breed them at the right times, you needed to protect them from predators, you needed to ensure they didn't freeze, get sick, or accidentally destroy themselves by doing what livestock did best, behaving inconveniently. Winter complicated everything. Animals ate far more during cold months, and their needs didn't politely decrease just because you were running out of resources. You had to monitor their weight, their behavior, their health, and their shelter. If one animal fell ill, it wasn't a minor problem, it was a threat to your household economy. A sick cow meant less milk, a limping sheep meant less wool, a goat with an infection meant fewer future kids, and veterinary knowledge was minimal. You didn't have medicine, You had intuition, experience, and hopeful improvisation. Shelter was another battle. Animals needed warmth, but not too much. Overheating created moisture. Moisture led to illness, and illness spread through barns faster than you could react. You needed the barn to be ventilated enough to prevent disease, sealed enough to keep out wind, and dry enough that hooves didn't rot. If you entered the barn in the morning and saw frost on your animals' backs, that wasn't an aesthetic moment. It meant the building needed fixing immediately. Livestock also shaped your social and economic life. A farmer with multiple cows had influence. A household with a strong flock of sheep could trade wool. A family with goats could sell milk or cheese. Livestock were dowries, inheritance, debt payments, and community leverage. A single cow could open doors in negotiations, patch strained relationships, or establish long-term alliances. In many rural areas, livestock weren't just wealth, they were identity. Calving and lambing seasons were high-stakes events. Newborn animals represented the next year's survival. A successful birth was cause for celebration. A difficult one meant hours of nerve-wracking labour. A failed one meant loss, not just emotional but economic. You monitored births with the intensity of a person watching their last coin spin on a table. Predators were always near. Wolves, lynx, bears. They viewed your farm less as a sacred space and more as a buffet. You protected your animals with fencing, fire, noise, and constant vigilance. Losing livestock to predators didn't just hurt, it endangered your winter plan. Medieval farmers took these threats personally because each animal wasn't an asset on paper. It was calories, clothing, fertility, and bargaining power walking on four legs. So yes, livestock were more valuable than you. Not because you didn't matter, but because without those animals, your chances of surviving winter plummeted dramatically. Their survival meant your survival. Their health meant your comfort. Their endurance meant your future. And in the harsh world of medieval Scandinavia, if things got desperate, the cow stayed. You? Well, you were negotiable. Winter didn't politely ask if your animals had enough to eat. It simply removed all edible vegetation from existence and left you with one question. Did you store enough hay, or are you about to find out what regret tastes like? Because when you were responsible for keeping cows, sheep and goats alive through months of unbroken cold, every single day became a tiny, exhausting gamble. You weren't feeding animals, you were gambling with your future, your survival, and your dwindling willpower. Hay wasn't simply a resource, it was the lifeline that separated a stable farm from a spiralling disaster. It had been collected during summer, baled or stacked in the loft, and guarded like treasure. Each forkful represented hours of sweating in the sun months earlier, long before winter showed up demanding repayment. And once the snow fell, hay transformed into a form of currency more precious than anything made of metal. The problem? Animals ate constantly. Cows needed shocking amounts of hay. Sheep needed less, but still enough to keep them warm and producing wool. Goats, enthusiastic, energetic little gluttons, devoured anything remotely edible. Winter feeding wasn't a matter of giving animals what they wanted. It was a calculation. How much can we afford to give without running out before spring? And how little can we give without the animals collapsing? Your goal wasn't to keep animals fat and happy. Your goal was to keep them alive at the lowest possible cost to your supply. Animals were expected to lose weight in winter. That was normal. What mattered was making sure they didn't lose too much to recover. Every morning, your first thought wasn't, I should stretch. It was, how much hay can I spare without creating future panic? But the gamble didn't end with rationing. No matter how carefully you measured out hay, nature found new ways to torment you. Some winters lasted longer than expected. A spring snowstorm could destroy your carefully balanced calculations with a single cold gust. A sudden freeze might lock your barn doors shut, turning a simple chore into a battle against ice that tried to glue everything in place. If the temperature dropped sharply overnight, animals burned more calories trying to stay warm, and suddenly your ration plan needed to be adjusted again. Then there was the physical labour. If you've never hauled hay in sub-zero temperatures, congratulations. You've never experienced the joy of frost forming on your eyelashes, while wind turns your hands into decorative ice sculptures. Hauling hay in winter wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. You carried a heavy load through slippery paths while the wind attempted to push you sideways. One misstep, one patch of hidden ice, and you could break an ankle, injure your back, or find yourself lying in the snow questioning every life decision you had ever made. And the animals didn't make it easier. Cows didn't politely wait for you to place hay in the trough. They crowded. They shoved. They exhaled clouds of hot breath in your face that smelled like everything wrong with the world. Sheep formed eager mobs that nearly trampled your boots. Goats, meanwhile, attacked the hay before it even reached the ground, treating your efforts like an interactive lunch performance. Sometimes the hay went mouldy if stored poorly. A damp bale could sicken animals, and illness spread fast in tight winter quarters. You didn't have diagnostic tools. You had observation, anxiety, and a growing sense of doom. If a cow refused feed, you didn't chalk it up to picky eating. You felt a cold wave of fear wash over you. Because when an animal began to weaken in winter, the odds of recovery plummeted, and if that animal died, so did your spring hopes. But the harshest part of winter feeding wasn't the labour or the anxiety, it was the terrible decision-making that starvation forced upon you. If you ran out of hay, if your calculations failed, or your harvest had been smaller than expected, or winter stretched just a few weeks too long, you faced a choice that medieval farmers dreaded more than anything. You chose which animals lived, not all, not most, the ones you could afford to keep alive. The weakest animals were culled first, not for meat, because a starving animal didn't produce good meat, but because feeding them wasted precious hay that could keep others alive. This wasn't cruelty, it was a ruthless, necessary kind of triage. A cow that wouldn't survive a winter consumed more than one that would. Sheep that couldn't recover from their weight loss took hay away from those that could. Goats that fell ill early meant losing both feed and future milk. Every decision cut into you. Every loss, whether through culling or starvation, shrunk your spring prospects. Fewer animals meant less milk, less wool, fewer newborns, less manure for fertilizing fields. A weakened farm wasn't something you repaired in a season. It affected the next year and the next, and sometimes entire generations. And yet you carried on. Every morning you bundled yourself in stiff, cold layers. You stepped into the wind. You dragged hay through pneu that reached your knees. You rationed. You measured. You tried not to think about the fact that you were cold, hungry, exhausted, and risking injury, all for livestock that might not survive anyway. You did it because the farm depended on it, because your family depended on it, because the animals, despite their demands, were your pathway through winter, and because out here, in this unforgiving landscape, you're cold, hungry, and hauling hay for something that might still die. If you imagine a medieval Scandinavian home as a warm, glowing refuge against the icy horrors outside, allow me to gently adjust that image by dropping a smoky bearskin on your dreams. Because while your longhouse was indeed warmer than the outdoors, it achieved this warmth by doubling as a slow cooking chamber for both your family and your lungs. These homes didn't hold heat, they held smoke. Warmth was the side effect. The longhouse was the centre of life, your sleeping quarters, kitchen, workshop, emergency barn, storage area, meeting hall, and occasional battlefield between children, animals, and adults losing their last shred of patience. Built from timber, turf, or a combination of both, the longhouse wasn't designed to make you feel happy, cozy, or emotionally fulfilled. It was designed for one purpose only: preventing your frozen body from becoming part of the landscape. But the real heart of the longhouse wasn't the walls, or the roof, or even the piles of bedding that smelled like a festival of damp wool. No, the heart was the hearth, the fire pit set in the centre of the room, which functioned as your space heater, stove, dryer, light source, and also your daily health hazard. A longhouse fire was not a gentle flame. It was a smouldering, smoky creature with moods and opinions. It burned unevenly, it spat sparks, It smoked aggressively, especially when fed fresh or damp wood, which was often, because storing perfect firewood all winter was a fantasy for people who lived in climates with mercy. The fire gave you heat, yes, but also gave you the gift of permanently irritated eyes, lungs that aged 3 decades during one bad storm, and a scent that clung to your clothing so completely that even wolves could probably smell your indoor lifestyle from a mile away. Ventilation existed, but existed is doing a lot of the work here. Some longhouses had a smoke hole in the roof. Others used gaps in the thatch or vents built into the walls. But winter winds didn't cooperate, and smoke did not politely float upward like it does in cozy illustrations. It drifted, it spread, it gathered in pockets. Some days the smoke refused to leave at all, choosing instead to visit every corner of the longhouse until the entire family was blinking tears away during every conversation. You didn't sit by the fire. You navigated the fire like a social event with unclear rules. Move too close, and your hair ignited. Move too far, and you froze. Stand up too quickly, and you inhaled a lungful of smoke dense enough to qualify as a solid. The art of survival meant learning to sit in exactly the right spot, close enough to feel heat, far enough to avoid becoming a lightly smoked human fillet. The longhouse interior was divided into zones: sleeping platforms along the sides, storage at the back, animals sometimes kept at the far end, and the hearth in the middle. But don't imagine stable, peaceful order. The smoke travelled freely. It didn't respect personal space. It drifted into bedding, clung to clothing, seeped into woven walls, filled your hair, and made every fabric you owned smell like the aftermath of a perpetual campfire. You learned to live with it. Your eyes adjusted, your lungs adjusted, your expectations adjusted. Eventually, smoke became another roommate, unpleasant, always present, and occasionally dangerous. Children grew up knowing how to crawl under the thickest layer of smoke to get fresh air near the floor. Adults developed a habit of wiping soot from their faces before bed. Even animals learned to position themselves strategically, choosing spots where the smoke was only mildly offensive rather than aggressively overwhelming. But the fire's necessity outweighed its terrors. Without it, the house would freeze, food wouldn't cook, clothes wouldn't dry, babies and elderly people wouldn't survive. Tools would crack, water would solidify, and morale, which was already on thin ice, would fall straight through into the metaphorical freezing lake of despair. So you fed the fire constantly, you watched it, tended it, negotiated with it. Longhouses weren't sealed, insulated spaces. Heat escaped, wind found cracks, cold seeped in. You needed that fire burning all day, all night. When storms howled outside, the hearth became the family's gravitational centre. People gathered around it, talked around it, worked around it, and slept near it. You might wake up coughing from the smoke, but you woke up warm, and that counted as a win in this climate. The roof beams overhead slowly blackened with soot. Over the years, they became shiny and smooth, like wood polished by centuries of smoke rather than hands. Visitors entering an old longhouse could tell exactly how many generations had lived there by the depth of the soot coating. This was historical record-keeping done by the air itself. The smell of a longhouse never left you. When you travelled, you carried it with you. A medieval Scandinavian could walk into another person's home and immediately identify how their fire burned, what kind of wood they used, how often they cooked, and whether their ventilation was decent, or whether they were just sitting in a cloud of misery pretending everything was normal. Fire solved your heating problems, your cooking problems, your drying problems, and your lighting problems, but every solution came with a smoky price. In many ways, your house was a negotiation between life and death. Warmth at the cost of clear air. In other words, the fire keeps you alive, the smoke slowly negotiates your exit. If you think modern winter days feel short, medieval Scandinavians would like a word, and that word would probably be help. Because in the north, winter darkness wasn't a seasonal inconvenience. It was a full-time job, a lifestyle, a commitment that nature made for you without your consent. When winter settled in, daylight didn't fade gently, it vanished dramatically, like a performer exiting the stage mid-line. The sun showed up only to remind you it existed, waved briefly over the horizon, and then rushed off to illuminate more fortunate parts of the world. For months, daylight shrank until it became something closer to a rumour than a reality. In the far north, the sun didn't rise at all. In the south, it rose reluctantly, hovered at a useless angle, and then dropped out of sight as if embarrassed. The result? Your farm, your home, your entire world spent most of the winter engulfed in darkness so thick it might as well have been a physical object. You didn't just experience darkness, you inhabited it. This meant productivity plummeted, not metaphorically, literally. When the sun provided only a few hours of dim light, every task had to be executed with military precision. If you needed to repair tools, fetch water, cut wood, mend fences, check on animals, or drag anything from one building to another, you did it in daylight or you didn't do it well. The sun was your supervisor, and unfortunately it kept the world's worst schedule. Picture this. You wake up in the darkness, you work in the darkness, you go to bed in the darkness. If you're lucky, you had a couple of hazy hours where the world looks more like twilight and less like a cave. Medieval Scandinavians didn't measure time in minutes or hours, they measured it in degrees of gloom. Morning gloom, afternoon gloom, evening gloom, and the kind of pitch-black night that swallowed entire landscapes like a cosmic vacuum. Inside the longhouse, darkness shaped everything. Even with the fire burning, light barely touched the far corners. Shadows clung to the walls and rafters like permanent residents. You learned to navigate your home not by sight, but by muscle memory. Every beam, stool, tool, sleeping platform and doorway had its place, and you knew them the way a blindfolded performer knows every inch of their stage. You also learnt the painful consequences of getting this wrong. In the dark, a misplaced wooden bucket could sabotage your shin. A low beam could assault your forehead. A sleeping goat could become an unexpected pillow, or a startled source of chaos. Medieval Scandinavians were essentially living escape room experts, but instead of solving puzzles, they were solving, how do I avoid tripping over something that might break my leg? Outdoor work in darkness was even worse. You moved carefully, deliberately, trying not to fall into hidden snowdrifts or step into half-frozen puddles. Even with torches or candles, visibility was terrible. Flames flickered in the wind, shadows danced wildly, and your own breath fogged up your line of sight. Since torches consumed precious resources, you didn't burn them casually, you saved them for tasks you absolutely couldn't do blind. Darkness also destroyed your internal clock. Without sunlight to signal morning or afternoon, time became a slippery concept. People woke when they felt rested, slept when exhaustion forced them, and tried to maintain routines based on communal agreement rather than natural cues. More than one medieval farmer woke in the morning only to discover hours later that it had been midnight the entire time. This lack of daylight wasn't just inconvenient, it reshaped your psychology. Darkness affected mood, motivation, and sense of reality. When the world felt like an endless night, the mind drifted. Some people grew irritable, others melancholy. Children became restless. Adults grew quiet. Superstitions flourished. In the dark, imagination filled in the void with spirits, omens, and things that may or may not have been there. With only flickering firelight to push back the blackness, shadows played tricks, and every creak from the walls felt amplified. Long nights also magnified isolation. When your farm was already remote, winter darkness severed your last ties to the outside world. Travel became dangerous. Paths vanished. Landmarks disappeared. You didn't visit neighbours. You hoped they were doing well and accepted that you wouldn't see them until daylight returned, like a shy but determined guest in spring. Darkness even dictated meal times. You ate earlier than you wanted, not because you were hungry, but because cooking was safer and easier before complete blackness settled. Once the pitch-black hours began, chores dwindled into small, quiet tasks. Mending clothes by the fire, carving tools, repairing harnesses, or simply sitting in the warmest spot and hoping your mind didn't wander into cold, bleak territory. Still, medieval Scandinavians adapted, not by conquering darkness, but by learning its patterns. They developed routines that matched the season, leaning into rest when daylight failed, and saving energy for the bursts of work daylight allowed. They treated light like gold and darkness like weather, unavoidable, overwhelming, but temporary. But make no mistake, darkness ruled the winter months. It slowed you down, exhausted your eyes, challenged your mind, and forced you to work harder to accomplish less. And it never apologized, because out here in the far north, the sun clocks out at noon and never checks back in. Cold in medieval Scandinavia wasn't a brief discomfort. It wasn't the chilly air you complain about when you forget your sweater. It wasn't even the dramatic sting of stepping outside into modern winter weather. No, medieval Scandinavian cold was a constant ongoing negotiation between your body and the universe, where the universe calmly insisted, "I can outlast you." The cold didn't want to hurt you quickly. It wanted to politely, methodically, and relentlessly rearrange your will to live. From the moment you opened your eyes in the morning, the cold greeted you like an unwanted roommate. It lurked in the corners of the longhouse, seeped under blankets, drifted through every seam in your clothing, and perched on your bones like a bird with nothing better to do. Even when you sat right beside the fire, the cold hovered at the edges of the warmth like it was waiting for a turn. The fire was temporary. The cold had tenure. You didn't get warm. You borrowed warmth. And the loan terms were terrible. Your hands, for example, were never comfortable. They alternated between stiff, numb, or painfully thawing. The cold affected your grip, your dexterity, your ability to carry tools, and your motivation to do absolutely anything. If you wanted to work outdoors, you accepted that your fingers would feel like wooden spoons strapped to your palms. Fine motor skills? Optional. Dropping things? Guaranteed. Your feet, meanwhile, were their own saga. Boots helped, but boots were not magical. They froze, they soaked, they stiffened. You could line them with wool, fur, straw, anything that created a barrier, but the cold always found a way to seep in. If you stood still too long while working outside, the cold crept up your legs with slow, sinister determination. The trick was to keep moving, even when movement felt like dragging slabs of ice attached to your ankles. But the cold didn't just target your extremities, it went for the whole body, slowly convincing you that your core temperature was dropping even when it wasn't fatal yet. You could feel the chill tightening your muscles, slowing your breath and settling into your joints like a grim reminder of your geographical choices. Medieval Scandinavians developed a kind of stoic relationship with cold. You didn't complain because complaining didn't help. The cold wasn't listening. Breathing was its own challenge. In harsh winter air, every inhale felt like you were inviting a tiny ice dragon into your lungs. Your nostrils froze, your eyelashes gathered frost, your beard, if you had one, turned into a crystallized sculpture whether you wanted it to or not. Even the simple act of talking outdoors felt strange as you watched your own breath float away like the last warmth you'd ever see again. Cold also made work slower, painfully slower. Tools that were perfectly manageable in summer suddenly felt heavier, stiffer and less cooperative. Wood became brittle. Metal chilled instantly upon touching it, sending flat bursts of cold up your arm. Ropes froze. Buckets froze. The lids of storage containers froze shut with the tenacity of a toddler refusing to give up a toy. Even your clothes became accomplices in the cold's campaign against you. They stiffened when damp. They collected frost. They held onto cold air like they were trying to preserve it for later. You could wear layer upon layer, wool, fur, linen, and still feel the chill slide between them like a polite but determined visitor. Dressing for winter wasn't about comfort. It was about delaying misery. Inside the longhouse, the cold behaved differently, like a so-steady drip of discomfort that refused to stop. The fire helped, but it helped in the very centre of the room. Every step away from the hearth was a step toward temperatures that felt like punishment. People arranged themselves like planets orbiting a tiny sun, each trying to get just enough warmth without stepping into the line of smoke. When you moved to the sleeping platforms at night, the temperature dropped so sharply that crawling under blankets felt like diving into an icy pond. Blankets did their best, but blankets couldn't fight drafts, and medieval households were full of drafts. Cracks in walls, gaps in roofs, airflow from doors. Cold found them all. You didn't simply bundle up. You built a defensive fort out of hides, wool, and whatever else you had, then prayed your toes didn't go numb again. The cold also influenced your psychology. It wore you down, not dramatically, not instantly, but steadily, day after day after day. It robbed you of energy, motivation and patience, tempers shortened, conversations quieted. Moving from one task to another required mental fortitude that modern humans reserve for tax season. You didn't dread winter storms. They were expected. You dreaded the everyday cold that hovered quietly in the background, waiting for you to acknowledge it. And then there was the fear, the soft, subtle fear that always lingered beneath the surface, not fear of freezing to death in some dramatic blizzard, although that was possible. No, fear of gradual cold exhaustion. Fear of frostbite creeping into fingers or ears before you noticed. Fear of hypothermia arriving politely, silently, like a guest who refuses to leave. Cold wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a villain with a monologue. It was a whispering presence that never gave you a moment alone. You didn't tell people, "I'm freezing." You said nothing and simply tried to keep moving, because out here, you're not freezing. You're slowly being convinced you are. In medieval Scandinavia, clothing wasn't an outfit, it was equipment, a protective system, a daily negotiation with death conducted through layers of wool, fur, and whatever else you could wrap around your trembling body. You didn't wake up thinking, "What should I wear today?" You woke up thinking, "How many layers do I need to not perish before noon?" Fashion existed, technically, but winter erased any desire to look appealing. Survival was the only dress code. Let's begin with wool, because wool was your second skin. Itchy, scratchy, slightly scelly, and absolutely essential. Medieval wool wasn't like the sleek, refined textiles people brag about today. It was thick, heavy, greasy. It had personality. Depending on how well it was processed, it might even have remnants of the sheep's former life. But wool trapped heat like nothing else. It held warmth even when damp, which was crucial because winter didn't care if you stayed dry, and neither did your daily chores. Every person in the household had wool garments. Tunics, trousers, dresses, hats, socks, mittens. You layered them until your silhouette resembled a padded scarecrow capable of limited mobility. Children waddled around like wool-filled barrels. Adults shuffled with the grace of people wearing 3 layers too many, but unwilling to remove any of them because the cold took that as a personal invitation. And fur. Fur was luxury, necessity, and armor rolled into one. Reindeer, fox, sheep, goat, bear, marten. If it grew warm fur and existed within walking or hunting distance, medieval Scandinavians found a way to wear it. Fur-lined coats weren't merely cozy, they were status symbols of survival efficiency. A good fur coat meant you could step outside without immediately regretting your decisions. A bad one meant frostbite was casually taking bookings. Hoods lined with fur were even more critical. Your head leaked heat faster than your patience leaked during a long winter. A fur hood insulated your skull, ears, neck, and occasionally your dignity. Without it, the wind treated your face like a test surface for cold-based weaponry. But clothing wasn't a single item, it was a system. A delicate balance of layers that worked together like teammates in a very cold, very high-stakes sport. Undergarments of linen or softer wool absorbed sweat, because even in freezing weather, hard work made you perspire, and moisture was your mortal enemy. Over that went thicker wool tunics and trousers. On top of that came heavier cloaks and outer garments, sometimes waterproofed with fish oil or animal fat, which gave them a distinctive aroma best described as necessary but not pleasant. Every piece had a job. A missing layer wasn't a fashion mistake, it was a survival failure. If you skipped socks, your toes protested violently. If you forgot mittens, your hand seized up. If you went outside without a cloak, you discovered exactly how quickly your core temperature could drop. Winter exposed any weakness in your clothing strategy with the same enthusiasm a teacher uses when grading an unprepared student. The challenge wasn't just wearing the right layers, it was maintaining them. Winter chewed through garments, seams loosened, threads snapped, wool thinned, fur shed, snow-soaked hems, ice-hardened cuffs, and smoke from the hearth embedded itself deep into every fibre until your entire wardrobe smelled like a longhouse with opinions. Repairing clothes became a daily ritual. Needles and thread were tools of survival, not hobbies. You patched holes the moment they formed. Waiting was not an option. A tear in your mitten wasn't an inconvenience. It was a future frostbite scar. A rip in your cloak wasn't embarrassing, it was dangerous. A seam bursting in your trousers meant an immediate sprint indoors before a very uncomfortable draft turned you into a winter cautionary tale. Shoes were another battlefield. Leather boots stuffed with wool, fur or straw were your fragile connection to the earth. Snow seeped in. Ice stiffened them. Wet leather froze into shapes that displayed none of the flexibility required for walking. You learned to dry shoes carefully, not too close to the fire, unless you enjoyed the smell of scorched leather, but not too far, or they'd still be frozen in the morning. Clothing also dictated how long you could do tasks outside. Too many layers and you overheated, sweat soaked your undergarments, and the moisture became ice the moment you slowed down. Too few layers and the cold drained your strength until you could barely move. Winter demanded a perfect equilibrium. Warm enough to function, cool enough to avoid sweating, layered enough to stay alive. And then there were the social aspects of winter clothing. You didn't impress anyone with style, you impressed them with insulation. If someone said, "That coat looks good," they meant that coat might prevent your death. Compliments were practical. Nice mittens translated to, "Your fingers may still be attached in the spring." Even courtship changed. Potential partners didn't look for fancy fabrics, they looked for weather-appropriate layering strategies. Nothing said long-term commitment, like someone who knew how to properly wrap a cloak in a storm. Clothing even shaped your posture and movements. With enough layers on, bending became a negotiation, crouching was dangerous, and running turned into flailing desperation. Everyone moved with the slow, deliberate caution of people pretending they weren't wearing their body weight in fabric. Yet without these layers, your body's warmth would flee instantly, leaving you shaking like a leaf in a snowstorm. You didn't judge clothing by appearance, you judged it by survival. If your garments worked, you endured winter. If they failed, your body followed shortly after. In medieval Scandinavia, firewood wasn't just a resource, it was the backbone of your entire existence. Forget coins, silver, or social status. The true measure of wealth, wisdom, and future happiness was the size, dryness, and stackability of your firewood pile. If you had a towering, well-seasoned stack of wood, people admired you. If you didn't, they quietly wondered what your funeral arrangements might look like. Because out here, in this cold-dominated world, one truth reigned supreme. Firewood was the difference between I'm managing and I regret every life choice that brought me here. Let's begin with the brutal reality. Cutting wood was not just a chore, it was a year-round occupation. You didn't simply go into the forest with an axe whenever you needed fuel. No, that kind of thinking belonged to warm countries. Scandinavian woodcutting required planning, strategy, timing, and a physique durable enough to survive a personal feud with trees. Most cutting happened in late spring or summer, when days were long and your hands weren't frozen into sculptural shapes. Trees had to be felled, stripped, sectioned, split, and stacked, and every step required strength, accuracy, and the ability to avoid being crushed by falling timber. If you slipped, misjudged, or swung wrong, the tree didn't give second chances. Trees were patient revenge specialists. They waited until humans got comfortable, then struck. But cutting the wood was only the first step. After splitting logs into pieces you prayed were small enough to dry but large enough to burn through freezing nights, you had to stack them. And stacking wood was an art form, equal parts engineering, patience, and stubbornness. A poorly stacked pile could collapse and ruin weeks of work. A well-stacked pile stood firm against wind, snow, and the desperate desire of wildlife to use it as shelter. Wood had to dry. Wet wood was a disaster. It burned poorly, smoked excessively, heated nothing, and made your longhouse smell like a damp mistake. Burning wet wood also ate through your supply faster, and wasting firewood was one step below treason. In medieval Scandinavia, if you tossed damp logs onto the fire, someone would look at you the way modern people look at someone microwaving fish in an office kitchen. Different woods had different values. Birch burned well and smelled pleasant. Pine burned hot but quickly, sending sparks flying dangerously. Fir and spruce crackled loudly and coated everything in sticky resin. Oak, when you could get it, burned long and steady, but oak trees did not grow everywhere, so they were prized like treasure. Each family knew which wood was nearby, which burned best, and which logs were best saved for emergencies, because the real fear wasn't cutting wood or stacking it, it was running out of it. Firewood shortages were a medieval Scandinavian nightmare. If the pile looked thin by midwinter, everyone in the household grew quiet. A shortage meant cold mornings, colder evenings, and dreadful calculations. You had to ration wood the way others rationed food. You fed the fire just enough to keep frostbite at bay, but not enough to waste heat. This meant making hard choices. Did you burn a bigger log tonight to keep the family warm during a storm? Or save it and hope no one woke up shivering hard enough to shake the bedding? Did you use extra wood to cook a hot meal, or make do with something simpler? Did you risk burning more fuel to dry clothes, or tolerate damp garments and hope they didn't freeze into your personal ice armour? Fire was your only heater, stove, and source of comfort, but fire's appetite was enormous. A long night could consume armloads of wood. A brutal storm could devour 2 days' worth. Fire didn't care about your feelings, your exhaustion, or your blisters. It only cared about being feed. Running out of wood didn't simply mean you were cold, it meant you were dangerously vulnerable. Without fire, water froze solid. Tools cracked. Food preparation became nearly impossible. People got sick from cold exposure, livestock barns chilled to deadly temperatures. Morale plummeted into absolute despair. Without fire, everything else fell apart like a badly stacked log pile. And here's the cruel twist. Getting more firewood in midwinter was a gamble with your life. Snowdrifts concealed tree stumps. Ice turned slopes into death traps. Axes slipped in frozen hands. Frostbite arrived faster than good decisions. Cutting firewood in January was like negotiating with winter while blindfolded. Yet sometimes you had no choice. If the pile dipped too low, you strapped on every layer you owned, took your axe, and marched into the icy forest like someone reenacting a heroic saga, but with less poetry and more slipping. Every blow of the axe felt harder. Every minute outdoors drained your strength. And with daylight nearly non-existent, you had hours, maybe 2, to work before darkness insisted you return home or else. Firewood shortages also created uncomfortable social dynamics. Households with plenty might help those with too little, but wood was wealth, you didn't give it away casually. Borrowing wood came with social strings, favours owed, future help promised, reputations judged. The phrase "they burn wood like they don't care about their future" was a legitimate criticism, and inside the longhouse, firewood dictated your daily life. The hearth wasn't just a fire, it was the centre of your universe. Every conversation happened near it, every meal depended on it, every night's survival hinged on its steady heat. Cold opinions, complaints, arguments, they all froze instantly if the fire burned low. Because medieval Scandinavia understood one absolute truth. No wood means no warmth. No warmth means no opinions. Cooking in medieval Scandinavia was an activity that hovered somewhere between daily necessity and acceptable arson. It wasn't relaxing, it wasn't creative expression, It wasn't something you did while humming happily. It was a full-contact indoor sport in which fire, smoke, boiling liquids, burning fat, unpredictable sparks, and gravity all conspired to see who would win first, you or the food. The hearth in the centre of the longhouse was your kitchen, your stove, and your constant antagonist. Unlike a modern stove that politely stays in one place and behaves itself, this fire acted like a moody relative, sometimes calm, sometimes explosive, and frequently in the way. There were no knobs to adjust, no timers, no temperature settings. The only control you had was how much wood you fed it, and how deeply you regretted your decisions. A pot didn't simmer. It either boiled violently or sat there refusing to heat at all. Flames didn't stay beneath the cookware. They leapt sideways, licking the air like they were testing escape routes. Spark shot upward, outward, and occasionally onto you. Cooking wasn't a process. It was a negotiation. You leaned over the fire constantly to stir, check, flip, or adjust something, and every single lean came with risk. Hair ignited, fur sleeves smoked, bits of clothing smouldered. If you got too close, your eyebrows became optional. If you pulled back too far, the food burned. If you didn't reach far enough, nothing cooked. It was a balancing act performed on slippery floors with smoke stinging your eyes. And the smoke made everything harder. You squinted through the haze, trying to decipher whether the bubbling in the pot was food cooking or the pot itself threatening to melt. Smoke blurred your vision, burned your throat, and clung to your hair like a persistent reminder of your culinary defeat. You coughed while stirring, you coughed while chopping, you coughed while serving. Cooking produced meals, yes, but also chronic coughing fits that often blotted out the will to enjoy said meals. Even the tools weren't forgiving. Iron pots weighed enough to double as blunt weapons. Lifting one off the fire required strength, precision, and the ability to avoid splashing boiling broth onto your hands. Wooden ladles were long, but not long enough to protect you from the steam that rose like a warning spirit. Pot hooks and iron chains suspended over the fire heated unpredictably, so grabbing the wrong piece of metal resulted in an instant lesson in never touch hot iron again. Oil and fat presented their own chaos. When fat dripped into the fire, the flames surged up like they had been waiting for this moment of glorious rebellion. The fire didn't simply flare, it roared. For a terrifying second, the entire longhouse felt like it was part of the cooking process. Everyone instinctively pulled back, except the person holding the pot, who had no choice but to maintain control and pretend everything was fine while inwardly screaming. Food preparation happened with the awareness that your meal could, at any moment, turn into a house fire. A dropped coal could roll under the bedding. A spark could land on a fur cloak. A child toddling too close could bump into a pot or stumble into the hearth. Even adults slipped on damp floors, losing grip of cookware and sending meals splattering into the fire or onto their legs. Burn injuries were common, and they came in all varieties. Singed hair, blistered hands, steam burns that didn't look dangerous until the pain set in hours later. A poorly timed stir could send boiling porridge splashing onto your wrists. A moment of distraction could lead to a glowing log rolling in your direction. Every cook bore the marks. Tiny scars, calloused hands, faint burns, quiet badges of culinary experience. The danger extended beyond cooking itself. Storage containers hung near the fire to stay warm or dry. Food drying overhead could drip fat into the flames. The wooden beams of the longhouse darkened over time, not just from smoke, but from centuries of cooking-related near disasters. Households developed a keen awareness of the fire's behaviour the way sailors understood the moods of the sea. A pop of burning resin signalled one thing. A sudden gust of wind down through the smoke hole signalled another. Everyone learned to read the fire's language. Mealtime didn't magically remove the danger either. Moving hot pots around the longhouse meant manoeuvring through narrow walkways, low ceilings, and family members who didn't always realise they were standing exactly where you needed to be. You carried hot food carefully, with both hands, shifting your weight to avoid spills. If food sloshed, it could burn you. If you tripped, it could burn someone else. If you dropped the pot entirely, you lost precious ingredients and possibly a piece of your sanity. Despite all this, meals had to happen. You couldn't simply skip cooking because the fire looked moody. Winter demanded hot meals to keep energy levels up, warm the body and maintain morale. Cold food was an option only in emergencies, and even then, it barely counted. Cooking was essential, dangerous, exhausting, nerve-wracking, but essential. So every day you approached the hearth like a cautious gladiator. You chopped ingredients by dim light, listened to the fire's unpredictable crackling, and hoped the meal would be edible, filling, and acquired without major injury. And when everything went right, when the flames behaved, the pot didn't topple, and the meal came out warm and nourishing, you felt victorious. Because in this world, dinner nourishes you, if it doesn't burn the house down first. Water is the most basic resource for human life. But in a medieval Scandinavian winter, water became a hostile opponent. It didn't cooperate. It didn't present itself. It didn't sit politely in buckets waiting for you to scoop it up. No, water transformed into a solid, stubborn enemy that required muscle, tools, and strategy, and the mental endurance of someone willing to fight frozen nature before breakfast. You didn't get water, you battled for it. The well in most households was the primary water source, your lifeline in all seasons, but winter twisted that lifeline into something far more complicated. Once temperatures dropped, the well mouth developed a sheet of ice that thickened day by day until it resembled a crystal lid forged by an irritated deity. Breaking through it was a daily ritual, a chore that demanded strength, accuracy, and the acceptance that you'd be doing the exact same thing tomorrow morning and the morning after that and the morning after that. You approached the well with an axe or iron bar, tools that were never truly warm because nothing was ever warm. The first blow cracked the ice, the second broke a small piece. The third reminded you that winter had once again added 3 inches of fresh frustration overnight. On particularly cold days, it took so long to reopen the well that the water beneath started to refreeze before you even finished the job. But wells weren't the only challenge. Streams, rivers, ponds, all the usual water sources froze into solid, glittering landscapes that mocked your desperation. Breaking ice on a running stream required constant attention. First you cracked the surface, then you skimmed water as quickly as possible before the hole sealed itself again like a living creature reclaiming its wound. If you were unlucky, the ice cracked unevenly, soaking your gloves, coat sleeves, or, if the gods were truly displeased, your boots. Wet clothing was a sentence, not a mistake. Buckets didn't help. Water froze in them too. A bucket filled with water turned into a bucket filled with a solid block that adhered to the wooden interior with stubborn loyalty. You carried that block indoors, set it next to the fire, and waited, and waited, and waited. Water didn't magically melt because you were tired or thirsty. It melted when it felt like it, which was usually slower than your patience and faster than your available firewood, forcing you into a cycle of endless, icy negotiations. Carrying water was no small task either. Buckets became heavier when sloshing was replaced by solid ice shifting inside. The air bit your face, the handles numbed your fingers, and the path between the well and the longhouse was a slippery obstacle course, rutted, icy, uneven, and ready to turn every trip into an accidental skating performance. Inside the longhouse, water didn't stay liquid for long. Cold drafts seeped through every crack, competing with the hearth for control. If you set a bucket too far from the fire, you returned to find a shimmering crust forming across the top. If you left a ladle inside, it froze into place like art. Washing, cooking, bathing, cleaning, all were dictated by how close you kept liquid water to the flames. And bathing? Winter turned bathing into a logistical nightmare no one approached with enthusiasm. Heating enough water took time, undressing took courage, redressing took speed, agility, and the coordination of someone trying to avoid hypothermia. For many, a bath in winter became a warm cloth, a quick scrub, and a quiet prayer that spring would arrive soon before cleanliness became purely theoretical. Animals needed water too, sometimes more than you. Watering livestock meant breaking ice on troughs, or hauling bucket after bucket from the well to the barn. animals drank enormous quantities, especially when eating dry hay. You tried with frozen hands to pour water quickly without spilling precious drops. A spilled bucket represented wasted labour, real painful labour that translated to another round of ice breaking. The barn wasn't warm enough to keep water liquid for long either. Sometimes you returned with fresh water only to find the previous bucket already frozen over. You chipped a hole in the ice so the animals could drink, but by the next morning it was sealed again. Winter didn't offer efficiency, it offered repetition. Travelling for water was even worse. Some farms didn't have a reliable well and depended on nearby streams or lakes. In those cases, water fetching involved outdoor treks across frozen terrain, lugging heavy containers, often in the dark. The return journey required balance, determination, and the emotional resilience to ignore the voice in your head screaming, "If you fall, everything spills and you start over." And let's discuss thirst. Not dramatic desert thirst, but slow, creeping dehydration, brought on by a combination of cold and exertion and inconvenience. You didn't drink because you weren't thirsty. You drank because you remembered you hadn't had water in hours. Thirst hid itself in winter, disguised beneath layers of cold air and fatigue. It sapped your energy quietly. And if you ignored it too long, your body began to falter in ways that the winter found particularly satisfying. Yet despite all of this, medieval Scandinavian families endured. They learned the rhythms of freezing water. They developed routines, break the ice, scoop quickly, transport carefully, place buckets near the fire, monitor constantly and repeat endlessly. Hydration wasn't a simple task. It was labour. It was vigilance. It was another step in the daily winter struggle to remain alive. Because out here, you don't fetch water, you wrestle it. Winter in medieval Scandinavia didn't just challenge your strength, it studied your weaknesses. It watched how tired you were, how hungry you'd become, how long you'd worked with numb hands, and then quietly whispered, "Now seems like a good time to ruin your week." Illness didn't politely visit, it stalked you. It moved around the longhouse, slipping into cracks of exhaustion and settling into bodies already strained from cold, darkness, and endless work. The first line of winter illness wasn't the dramatic plague or rare disease. It was the simple cold, except nothing about medieval colds was simple. A modern sneeze is mildly annoying. A medieval Scandinavian sneeze was a bad omen. Once your nose started running, it didn't stop. Once your cough began, it echoed through the longhouse for weeks. And because the entire family shared one smoky, chilly, poorly ventilated space, everyone got sick together. There was no staying home to rest. You were already home, and rest was a luxury winter didn't provide. The cold weakened the body in ways you could feel, but couldn't always explain. Your immune system wasn't operating at full strength. How could it? You were underfed, you were overworked. You were sleeping in frigid conditions that didn't allow your body to fully recover. Even if you were eating regularly, the food lacked the variety needed for strong health. Vitamin deficiencies were normal, not recognized, not named, but deeply felt. But malnutrition didn't hit like a dramatic collapse. It crept in slowly. Your energy dipped first, then your breath shortened, your skin cracked, your nails weakened, your mood dimmed. Cuts took longer to heal. Bruises lingered. A small infection could suddenly swell, redden, and become a silent threat. In winter, every injury carried a risk because your body simply didn't have the strength to fight back. Respiratory illnesses were especially common. The combination of cold air, constant smoke, and close quarters created the perfect environment for coughing fits that shook your ribs. Bronchitis, pneumonia, and other lung infections lurked everywhere. The smoke from the hearth, which was essential for your survival, also irritated your respiratory system daily. You breathed in soot, you breathed in fumes, you breathed in every cough your neighbour released because personal space did not exist. And when illness took hold, there was very little you could do. There were no doctors in most rural areas. Herbal knowledge existed, but winter limited the availability of plants. You couldn't gather new herbs under snow and ice. What you had stored was what you had. Warm broths, heated stones and wool blankets helped, but only if your household had enough fuel and strength to spare. Then there were frost injuries, winter's cruel reminder that the human body wasn't designed for temperatures this unforgiving. Frostbite didn't start with dramatic pain. It began with numbness. The kind that tricked you into thinking this isn't so bad. But numbness was the warning sign. If you didn't react, the cold continued its quiet work, turning fingers stiff, ears pale, toes waxy. If damage set in deeply enough, flesh died. You didn't have surgical help. You didn't have clean bandages. You barely had the time or tools to treat the aftermath. Frostbite wasn't just an injury, it was a lasting disability. Chilblains, painful, itchy, swollen areas caused by repeated exposure to cold, were another constant companion. They formed on hands and feet, turning simple movements into a miserable ordeal. But you couldn't stop working just because your skin screamed at you. You pushed through the pain because stopping wasn't an option. For children, winter illnesses were especially dangerous. Small bodies lost heat faster. They needed more food, more rest, and more care. All things winter didn't provide generously. A child's cough could turn into something far more serious. Parents knew the danger. They watched their children's chests rising and falling too quickly, listened to the rasp of breath, and understood how fragile survival truly was. Injury also fed illness. A cut that would heal easily in summer could turn infected in the cold months. With your immune system weakened, infections spread rapidly. Swelling, fever, delirium, symptoms you recognized but couldn't treat effectively. You tried warm compresses, you tried herbs, you tried prayers, but winter had a way of turning small problems into life-altering crises. And winter didn't just affect your body, it shaped your mind. Depression, though unnamed, was real. The darkness, cold hunger, and constant strain wore down your mental resistance. When your mind weakened, your body followed. Stress lowered immunity. Fear tightened your chest. Hopelessness made every task harder. You weren't just fighting disease, you were fighting the season's psychological weight. And yet medieval Scandinavians endured. They tended to one another. They used what knowledge they had. They created routines that supported recovery as best they could. They rested when they could, gathered near the fire, shared warmth, and waited, because waiting was often the only treatment available. But make no mistake, winter illness had the home field advantage. It struck when it wanted, it lingered as long as it pleased, and it never apologized. Because in this unforgiving world, you didn't catch a cold, the cold caught you. In medieval Scandinavia, an injury wasn't a temporary setback. It wasn't a reason to call in sick. It wasn't even an inconvenience. An injury was a plot twist in your life story, one that could instantly transform you from productive community member to someone everyone quietly worried about. Winter was already trying to break you psychologically and physically. Add an accident, and winter didn't just test you, it rewrote your entire future. The reason was simple. Every winter chore required strength, balance, coordination, and the reflexes of someone who ideally didn't want to die. And unfortunately, winter conditions were built like a trap. Ice covered everything, paths, roofs, steps, tools, your own clothes, and every misstep offered the opportunity for disaster. Wood cutting, water hauling, barn chores, snow clearing, repair work, animal handling, every task was one slip away from a life-changing injury. Start with slips and falls, the most common winter accidents. Ice hid under new snow, under old snow, under shadows. Ice was the ninja of the natural world. You walked outside carrying a bucket of water or an armload of firewood, planted your foot confidently, and suddenly the earth betrayed you. A fall could break bones, twist ankles, crack ribs, or knock you unconscious. And here's the problem. Broken bones didn't heal right. Not without proper care, not without warmth, not in the cold, and certainly not when you had to keep working anyway. A broken wrist meant you couldn't grip tools, a broken leg meant mobility was gone, a cracked rib meant breathing was a chore. In a world where survival demanded constant movement, any injury that limited your ability to work was catastrophic. Woodcutting posed a different category of danger, one involving large blades, heavy logs, and slippery footing. The axe was both your ally and your enemy. One moment you swung with perfect control, the next your cold, stiffened hands misjudged the angle. Axes bit deeply, into wood, into the ground, and into whatever unfortunate body part moved too slowly. A glancing blow could slice fingers. A direct hit could remove them. A mistimed chop could lodge the axe in your foot or shin. People lived, yes, but they lived differently afterwards. Even tasks that seemed simple, like carrying hay or grain, were dangerous. A bale on your shoulder blocked your vision. A misstep could send you tumbling into a pile of tools or frozen ground. Hauling feed barrels across icy ground became an event worthy of applause, if you made it without injury. Even barn chores were perilous. Animals slipped on icy floors and crashed into you. Cows kicked. Goats darted underfoot. Sheep bumped into you when frightened. One startled animal could topple you into a wall, knock you onto a pitchfork, or pin you beneath its weight. And yes, being pinned by a frightened half-ton cow was a genuine occupational hazard. Then there were frost injuries, the kind that made you lose sensation at the precise moment when you most needed your senses. Touching cold metal with bare skin could tear flesh. Handling frozen ropes or tools could rip skin from your palms. Frost-numb fingers meant you couldn't grip properly, increasing the risk of dropping something heavy or something sharp. Frostbite didn't care if you were doing your best. It took advantage of distraction. Inside the longhouse, injuries were still possible. A slip on the damp animal skins. A pot overturned on your leg, hot or cold, both painful. A fall from a sleeping platform. A cut from a poorly lit workbench. Winter didn't need outdoor conditions to injure you, it simply needed you to exist. But the real tragedy wasn't the injury itself. It was the aftermath, because there was no sick leave, no recovery plan, no physical therapy, no doctor to set bones properly, a fractured arm healed crooked. A dislocated shoulder didn't go back into place smoothly. A sprained ankle stayed weak forever. Medieval Scandinavians didn't recover, they adapted permanently. An injured person had to continue contributing somehow. Maybe they shifted to less physical chores, mending clothes, tending children, repairing tools, monitoring the fire, or preparing food. But even these tasks required strength and dexterity, and winter made everything harder. If you couldn't stand for long, couldn't grip, couldn't lift, couldn't walk far, or couldn't tolerate cold, you weren't useless, but you were vulnerable. And every vulnerability made the entire household weaker. Families compensated, yes, but compensation meant shifting workload onto others who were already overworked. If one person fell ill or got injured, the whole winter rhythm changed. Children grew up faster because they had to fill in. Elders stepped in to do tasks they hadn't done in years. Neighbours helped when they could, but winter limited how often that was possible. Travel was difficult. Risks were high. Even a good-hearted community couldn't prevent the ripple effects. Some injuries caused slow, painful declines. A twisted knee might not kill you, but it made every outdoor task more exhausting. A deep cut, even a mundane one, could become infected, swelling, reddening, throbbing until it affected your sleep and drained your energy. Tending wounds wasn't easy. Clean cloth was scarce. Warm water took effort to obtain. Herbs were limited, and infections didn't care how needed you were. They spread because winter weakened immune systems, and in the harshest cases, injuries meant complete loss of ability. A crushed limb, a serious fall, a severe burn, these weren't injuries so much as life-changing events that restricted what jobs you could perform for the rest of your life. Winter didn't ask if you were ready for a career change. It simply assigned one. Woodcutter turned fire tender. Hunter turned inside worker. Stable hand turned slow-moving caretaker. Farmer turned dependent. Winter reinvented your life whether you liked it or not, because in medieval Scandinavia, there's no sick leave, just permanent lifestyle adjustments. In medieval Scandinavia, hunger wasn't an occasional discomfort, It was a companion, a persistent, whispering presence that followed you from sunrise to sundown and often joined you in your sleep. It shaped your moods, influenced your decisions, and quietly rewired your personality. Hunger wasn't dramatic like illness or sudden like injury. It was slow, steady, and patient. It didn't take your strength all at once. It borrowed pieces of you day after day until you realized you'd changed into someone who measured life in spoonfuls rather than hours. Winter rationing wasn't optional. It was an art form, a science, and a moral dilemma rolled into one. When the season began, every household calculated their supplies with grim precision. How much grain do we have? How much dried fish? How much smoked meat? How many mouths? How many months? The numbers never looked generous. They looked like a puzzle in which every wrong answer meant hunger tightening its hold later in the winter. Meals shrank. Portions got smaller. The early winter bowls of porridge, thin but comforting, slowly turned into something more symbolic than satisfying. You didn't fill your bowl. You apportioned your survival. Every serving was measured. Every extra bite was a negotiation. You ate just enough to keep yourself useful, not enough to feel full. Fullness was a distant, suspicious memory, and the human mind reacted exactly as you'd expect. It adapted, not always nicely. Hunger changed your patience first. Small inconveniences felt like personal attacks. A dropped tool sparked irrational rage. A burned piece of bread inspired existential despair. Children bickered more. Adults snapped faster. Even animals irritated you with their chewing, their bleating, their simple existence near your diminishing food supply. When your stomach was empty, everything around you seemed designed to test your remaining sanity. Next, hunger changed your priorities. You thought less about comfort, conversation, or chores and more about food. Planning it, stretching it, imagining it. Hunger sharpened your awareness of smell. The faintest scent of cooking made your stomach lurch with hope. You noticed crumbs on the table, scraps on the floor, or leftovers stuck to the bottom of a pot with a clarity that bordered on spiritual awakening. And hunger wasn't equal. It didn't affect everyone in the same way. The elderly sometimes surrendered their portions to children. Parents secretly ate less so their families could eat more. Workers doing the hardest labour received the largest servings because survival wasn't sentimental, it was strategic. A farmer without calories couldn't chop wood, haul water, or tend livestock. Without labour, the entire household collapsed. Hunger also transformed kindness. In summer, you might offer neighbours a loaf of bread without thinking twice. In winter, generosity became a negotiation with the future. Giving food meant losing food. Sharing too much endangered your own family, but refusing to share threatened your relationships. Communities in winter lived in a paradox. Help each other, but not so much that you weaken your own chance of survival. It was a balance that made even the most compassionate people grow cautious. Then there was the quiet anxiety of watching supplies shrink. Every glance into the grain store felt like a judgment. Every winter storm threatened to stretch your rations thinner. Every time someone took an extra scoop, your heart tightened. You became meticulous, defensive, hyper-aware of quantities. Hunger trained you to think like an accountant with emotional damage. And yet the body still required food. Sleep didn't erase hunger. Work didn't distract from it. Resting didn't reduce it. Hunger kept pace with every movement, every breath, every hour spent waiting for winter to loosen its grip. And as reserves dwindled, you learned to manage your body differently. You moved slower to conserve energy. You spoke less to conserve breath. You worked in bursts, rushing at chores when you had morning strength, then fading later in the day. You grew cold faster. You laughed less. You stared into the fire more often than you meant to. Even your imagination changed. Dreams turned into feasts, tables heavy with bread, thick stews, roasted meats. You woke up to reality with disappointment so sharp it felt like nausea. Hunger wasn't just physical, it infiltrated your thoughts. In severe shortages, hunger forced brutal choices. You slaughtered animals earlier than planned, knowing it weakened your spring prospects. You thinned out livestock to reduce their feed requirements. You boiled bones for broth until they yielded nothing. Some families gathered bark, lichen, or edible weeds beneath snowdrifts, anything that added bulk to meals. You stretched food until stretching became a metaphor for your own endurance. And when hunger reached its deepest levels, practicality overrode emotion. Starvation made you calm in strange ways, not peaceful, but focused. Decisions became ruthlessly logical. You didn't shrug and say, "We'll manage." You calculated. You rationed. You irrationed. Hunger didn't make you weaker. It made you efficient. It stripped away everything unnecessary and left only the essential, survival. Winter hunger didn't end because you beat it. It ended because spring finally arrived, bringing new plants, warmer days, and the return of hope. But the memory stayed. Hunger was not something you forgot. It shaped how you stored food next summer, how you planned your harvest, how you taught your children, how you looked at every meal for the rest of your life. Because in medieval Scandinavia, starvation doesn't make you weak, it makes you practical. Winter in medieval Scandinavia didn't just freeze the lakes, the rivers, and your water buckets. It froze your entire social calendar. Your world shrank so dramatically that it felt as though the land itself was pushing inward, squeezing your connections down to a handful of people you saw every day, whether you liked them or not. Social life didn't slow down. It stopped, crystallized, and sat there like a block of ice that wasn't going to melt until the sun finally remembered your part of the world existed. Isolation wasn't a mood, it was a built-in feature of life. Farms sat far from one another, separated by forests, hills, and terrain that summer made difficult and winter made downright hostile. In warm months, you could visit neighbours, trade goods, share news, or at least see someone else's bee, but winter wiped out travel options with ruthless efficiency. Snow-buried paths, ice-hid dangers, darkness made landmarks vanish, and the cold itself whispered, "Try walking, I dare you." Most people didn't dare. Travelling between farms in winter was a major decision, not a casual stroll. You prepared the way a modern person prepares for a cross-country road trip. You bundled in every layer you owned. You carried torches you prayed wouldn't go out. You navigated by memory, tree shapes, and the few surviving markers that weren't hidden under drifts. Even then, the journey was dangerous. One wrong turn, one sudden storm, one patch of ice, and you became a story people told later in hushed voices. So most families stayed put for months. This meant your social life narrowed to the group of people inside your longhouse, your family, maybe a hired worker or two, possibly a grandparent, and whatever animals happened to be living at the far end of the building. These were the people you talked to, argued with, laughed with, worked with, and occasionally resented so deeply you needed to step outside and scream into the wind. Except you couldn't scream into the wind because it might freeze your throat on contact. Being stuck together in a single smoky room for an entire season was its own psychological trial. Voices carried. Secrets didn't exist. Every sigh, every cough, every complaint echoed through the space like an announcement. Privacy wasn't a concept. You slept near each other, ate near each other, worked near each other, and because the longhouse was dark for so much of the day, you spent hours simply sitting within arm's reach of the same faces. And even though humans are social creatures, too much social contact, especially confined, stressful contact, is its own sort of burden. Tempers frayed, patience thinned. Small disagreements could explode into multi-week grudges. If someone chewed too loudly or snored too aggressively or hogged the warmest spot near the fire, you noticed. Oh, you noticed. But you couldn't get away from them. The longhouse wasn't built for escape. It was built for containment. Children felt it too. Their world shrank to the size of the building, which meant their energy had nowhere to go. They played games in corners, made noise, argued, asked too many questions, or paced restlessly like small frustrated wolves. Adults loved them, of course, but adults also occasionally fantasized about temporarily relocating children to the roof for fresh air. Even pets. A dog curled up by the door, a cat prowling for mice, felt like part of the social ecosystem. You spoke to them, you confided in them, you blamed them for things they definitely did not do. Winter turned everyone into both family and hostage. And yet the opposite was also true. Isolation made companionship precious. When someone knocked on your door, or rather, pushed the heavy barrier aside and stepped in, everyone noticed. Visitors were rare, and they brought something winter couldn't freeze. News, fresh stories, gossip, hints of how other households were faring. Maybe someone married, maybe someone died. Maybe someone's cow disappeared in a storm and dramatically returned 3 days later like a furry legend. These updates mattered. They were tiny windows into a world larger than your longhouse, reminders that you weren't alone in your struggle. Even the briefest conversation with a passing neighbour or travelling merchant could electrify the household. People leaned in, people listened, people clung to details the way modern people cling to phone notifications. But those visits were dangerous to make and dangerous to receive. If someone arrived ill, sickness spread instantly. If someone arrived with a problem, starvation, cold, loss, you had to decide whether helping them jeopardized your own household. Hospitality was a moral duty, but winter twisted it into a logistical question with life or death consequences. For most of the season, loneliness was a constant, heavy presence. Humans needed variety, and winter didn't provide it. You craved different voices, different perspectives, different faces. Instead, you got the same circle of weary people trying their best not to go stir-crazy. When the sun finally returned, when the snow melted, when the paths became passable again, social life resumed with an almost desperate enthusiasm. Weddings happened, markets reopened, feasts were organised. People talked so much they practically made up stories just to have fresh material. Because winter taught one truth that medieval Scandinavians understood deeply: your social circle is whoever didn't freeze this week. Winter in medieval Scandinavia wasn't just a season, it was a presence, heavy, watchful, unpredictable, and when you're trapped in darkness for months, surrounded by cold that feels sentient, exhaustion that feels personal, and silence that feels crowded, you start asking questions. Questions like, why did the cow stop producing milk? Why did the barn creak at night? Why did the storm strike right after someone said something unlucky? And because there were no scientific answers, no meteorology, no psychology, no germ theory, people turned to the tools they did have: stories, symbols, rituals, and the passed down wisdom of generations. Superstition wasn't naive. It was a strategy, a shield, a rule book for surviving a world that felt far too large, too dark, and too uninterested in your comfort. In the dead of winter, every sound outside the longhouse felt meaningful. The crack of ice on the roof wasn't just nature, it was a sign. A knock against the wall from shifting beams wasn't simply wood, it was a presence. The moaning of the wind became a vocabulary full of warnings, omens, and the uncanny sense that the world beyond the hearth had opinions about you. Even inside, shadows flickered strangely in firelight, and smoke curled in patterns that seemed deliberate. And because medieval people's imaginations were sharpened by fear and isolation, they interpreted these things the only way a human mind can when information is scarce. Something caused this, someone meant this, something might be watching, so superstition filled in the blanks. Omens were everywhere. If a candle flickered unexpectedly, it meant someone far away was thinking of you, either with goodwill or with ill will, depending on how that flame behaved. If a raven perched near the house, it was a messenger, sometimes from living neighbours, sometimes from spirits, sometimes from something else entirely. If the family dog stared at a corner for too long, people exchanged glances. Dogs sensed things humans could not, after all. Even the weather had meaning. Sudden temperature spikes, unexpected thaws, eerie stillness before a storm. These were more than meteorological quirks. They were atmospheric messages, warnings, signs that winter had decided to rearrange your plans. Rituals became anchors in the chaos. Households performed winter customs not because they were quaint, but because they offered structure when the world felt uncontrollable. Before heavy storms, some families whispered protective phrases into the wind. Before lighting the morning fire, someone might tap the hearthstone for luck. When hanging new meat or fish for storage, people murmured small blessings, not out of piety, but out of practical terror. If the food spoiled, you wouldn't survive. Better to give fate something to work with. People place protective objects around the home. Carved runes, iron pieces, bundles of herbs saved from summer, animal bones arranged in deliberate ways. A token tucked into a doorway wasn't decoration. It was a psychological barrier against everything winter threatened. Illness, misfortune, hunger, despair. You didn't need proof that it worked. You only needed hope. Stories mattered too, deeply. Winter nights were long and stories filled them, not just for entertainment, but as instruction manuals disguised as legends. Tales of spirits wandering blizzards, creatures hiding in forests, hearth spirits who punished laziness, all conveyed practical wisdom. Don't go out alone, respect the fire, listen to the wind, pay attention to signs. Folklore explained danger in a way that made it feel manageable. If you angered a spirit by neglecting your chores, you could fix that by improving your behaviour. If the land grew silent, it wasn't random, it was a sign to stay close to home. If someone dreamed of disasters, the dream was a warning, giving you time to prepare. Superstition gave fear structure. Fear needed explanations. If a child fell sick in the night, the family didn't shrug and say, viruses. They searched for meaning. Did someone break a taboo? Did someone forget a ritual? Did a visitor bring misfortune? Humans are meaning-making creatures, and winter amplified that instinct. When your life depended on predicting the unpredictable, you looked for patterns everywhere. This didn't mean people were irrational. In many cases, superstition was rooted in observation. If you ignored the signs of a coming storm, you risked freezing. If you dismissed unusual animal behaviour, you risked losing livestock. If you mocked rituals meant to keep luck intact, people blamed you if something went wrong. Not because they were vindictive, but because winter survival required caution, and superstition was the language of caution. Community beliefs kept order. During the isolating months, shared rituals created unity. A family that believed together endured together. Mutual superstition formed social rules, unspoken contracts about how to behave, what to notice, and how to respond to danger. If everyone interpreted signs the same way, decision-making became easier. Superstitions also gave comfort. If bad things happened because of fate or spirits or omens, then suffering wasn't random. It had reasons. And if it had reasons, perhaps it also had remedies. Perhaps misfortune could be persuaded, negotiated with, or softened. When life felt chaotic, believing in hidden order was its own form of survival. In the end, superstition wasn't decoration. It was a winter survival tool, a compass in the dark, a framework for understanding a world that offered no explanations. Because in a season where logic froze solid, when logic fails, folklore clocks in. If you think medieval Scandinavian winter days were brutal, the nights were far worse. Because nighttime on a farm didn't pause, didn't slow down, and certainly didn't care about how tired you were. The darkness didn't just swallow the landscape, and it swallowed your schedule. The farm operated on its own logic, its own dangers, and its own relentless demands, many of which arrived after the sun had abandoned you. Winter didn't care that you wanted sleep. Sleep was a luxury for climates that didn't try to kill you every 5 minutes. Night was when the farm tested you, quietly, constantly, and with the kind of pressure that didn't break quickly, but instead eroded you slowly, like ice turning stone into powder. Because while you might have wanted rest, the animals didn't rest, the fire didn't rest, the cold didn't rest, and the longhouse didn't rest either. It creaked, shifted, moaned, and behaved like a living creature with questionable intentions. Let's start with the simplest truth. Fires must be fed, even at night. The hearth kept your family alive, but it also behaved like a needy toddler demanding attention at irregular intervals. If no one fed the fire, the longhouse temperature plummeted. Bedding chilled, water froze. Elderly family members shivered dangerously, babies struggled. And once the house grew cold, warming it up again required precious firewood you could not afford to waste. So someone, usually multiple someones, woke up through the night to check the embers. A sleepy hand fumbled with logs, stirred coals, coaxed tiny flames into life. If the fire dimmed too much, panic set in. If it flared too strongly, sparks threatened the ceiling beams. You weren't just tending warmth, you were preventing disaster. Meanwhile, animals needed attention too. Livestock weren't clocked out for the night. They shifted, bleated, moaned, stamped hooves, knocked into walls, sometimes fought each other, or occasionally signalled illness. If an animal sounded wrong, too quiet, too restless, too loud, you got up. Instantly. Because a distressed animal wasn't simply a problem for tomorrow. It was a problem that could die before sunrise. You stepped into the cold half asleep, carrying a lantern that flickered feebly in the draught. You trudged across icy ground, entered the barn, or the animal section of the longhouse, and checked on the creatures whose survival was tied directly to your own. Sometimes you found nothing. Sometimes you found frost forming too thickly. Sometimes you found a sheep tangled in its own tether, or a goat with its head stuck somewhere regrettable. Or worse, you found a predator's tracks, because yes, nighttime predators loved winter. Wolves, foxes, lynx, even the occasional bear if it wasn't fully committed to hibernation. Predators followed the smells of livestock, warmth, or weakness. They moved silently in the dark, their paws soft on snow. The wind masked their approach. Your dog barked, or growled, or stood rigid, staring into the shadows with the kind of focus that made your blood run colder than the air. And when that happened, you didn't ignore it. A wolf sniffing at your barn door wasn't a poetic moment. It was an immediate crisis. You grabbed whatever weapon was closest, a spear, an axe, a club, a torch, or the loudest member of your family. You shouted. You banged metal against wood. You made enough noise to convince the predator that your farm was too much trouble to bother with. Not because you were brave, because you were desperate not to lose the animals you relied on. But predators weren't the only nighttime visitors. Winter storms often intensified at night, turning roofs into trembling wooden shells under the weight of accumulating snow. You woke to strange creaks, wood bending, snow shifting, ice cracking. The house whispered warnings. Sometimes it screamed them. You had to leap up, climb ladders in the dark, and knock snow off the roof before it collapsed inward. Doing so meant standing on slick wooden beams, in freezing wind, holding tools with the numb fingers at hours when sane people should be asleep. Then there were winds, howling, roaring, battering the longhouse like invisible giants. The sound shook walls and rattled every loose hinge. A good storm could wake even the heaviest sleeper. You lay there listening, wondering whether the roof would hold, whether the barn would survive, whether the fences you built in better weather were now lying somewhere out in the snow like defeated soldiers. Even when nothing disastrous happened, sleep was fragmented, broken into thin slices scattered throughout the night. You dozed lightly, never fully dropping into unconsciousness, because the farm trained you to be alert. Any sound might mean danger. Any shift of wind might mean cold creeping deeper into the house. Any cry from an animal might demand immediate action. And if someone fell ill during the night, and winter offered sickness generously, you tended them by firelight. You checked fevers, adjusted blankets, offered water that you'd kept from freezing earlier, whispered reassurances that you barely believed. Night made sickness worse, darker, heavier, more ominous. People feared nighttime fevers the way modern people fear sudden medical emergencies. Then there was the psychological toll. When you spend every night in survival mode, listening, checking, reacting, rest becomes a foreign concept. You might lie down, but your mind didn't. Your ears strained for noises. Your body twitched awake at the slightest movement. You slept like someone expecting trouble, because trouble was exactly what winter delivered. And yet the farm demanded work again at dawn, if you could call the faint bluish glow dawn. You rose groggy, stiff and exhausted, your face lined by smoke and stress, your body running on determination more than sleep. Winter didn't reward rest. It punished it. Rest meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant consequences, because in this season, where everything depended on staying alert, sleep is optional, survival isn't. Winter in medieval Scandinavia didn't simply strain your body, it strained your relationships. Every single day. The longhouse wasn't a home so much as an emotional pressure cooker where the temperature was cold, but the tempers certainly weren't. The moment the snow sealed the world shut, you and your family were trapped together in a smoky wooden tube with limited daylight, limited food, limited privacy, and unlimited opportunities to get on one another's nerves. The longhouse was crowded, loud, and intensely communal. Families didn't live near one another, they lived on top of one another. Parents, children, grandparents, hired farmhands, visiting relatives, and even some animals all shared one continuous space. There were no bedrooms, no private corners, not even a quiet spot where you could stare meaningfully into the distance and reconsider your life choices. If you wanted solitude, your options were step outside and freeze, or pretend to be asleep. Every sound echoed. Every sigh announced itself. Every whispered conversation wasn't whispered enough. Children fidgeted, parents argued, elders narrated past winters with the confidence of people who believed they were being helpful. New parents tried to soothe babies who definitely picked the worst season to be born. Toddlers discovered their ability to scream with impressive enthusiasm. And the teenagers, medieval teenagers, slept late, complained often, and generated more drama than the sagas. You loved them, of course you did. But also, you considered throttling them at least twice a week. The smallest habits became monumental. The way someone stirred the fire too aggressively, the way another person slurped their porridge, the way your brother breathed too loudly near the hearth, the way your sister talked in her sleep, the way someone's boots were always in the wrong place, the way your father snored with the full confidence of a man certain no one would smother him with a wool blanket. Close quarters magnified everything, and because food was rationed, firewood was monitored, and sleep was fragmented, everyone's patience ran thin. Arguments weren't debates, they were explosions. Who used extra hay in the bedding? Who forgot to close the barn door properly? Who took larger portions than their share? Who didn't take their turn tending the fire? Who left the latch loose so the goats got into the grain again? Each disagreement came packaged with stress, hunger, exhaustion, and the knowledge that winter wasn't even halfway over. Yet despite the tension, winter forced collaboration. You couldn't afford to hold grudges long. If you were angry at someone, you still had to work with them to maintain the fire, repair the roof, manage the animals, cook meals, and keep the longhouse livable. Winter didn't pause while you sorted out your relationships. If anything, it encouraged you to get over your emotions with remarkable efficiency. Because the truth was simple, you needed each other. One person alone couldn't survive. A household fractured by bitterness wouldn't make it through February. So cooperation wasn't optional, it was mandatory. Families developed rhythms to minimize conflict. Some members rose early to tend the fire. Others handled animals during the morning feeding. Others prepared breakfast. Others fetched water. Others cleaned or mended clothing or supervised the children. Everyone had a role because lacking one person's labour put pressure on the entire group. Even the most stubborn relatives found ways to work together. A grumpy uncle might not speak to anyone for 3 days, but he'd still fix tools or check the fences. A frustrated mother might snap at her children but still share her blanket during icy nights. A teenager might roll their eyes through an entire chore, but they'd still haul firewood because the alternative was letting the family freeze. Relationships also deepened in surprising ways. Winter created long stretches of forced togetherness, hours spent around the fire mending clothes, telling stories, carving tools, or simply enduring the silence together. These moments didn't always feel meaningful at the time, but months later, they became the memories that held families together. Shared laughter for a small accident, a whispered conversation in the dark, a collective sigh of relief after surviving a storm. All of it bonded people in ways peaceful seasons never achieved. Grandparents told stories of past winters, times when storms were worse, food scarcer, predators bolder. Children listened with wide eyes, both terrified and reassured. Such storytelling wasn't entertainment, it was instruction, emotional guidance disguised as legend. It reminded the household that others had endured, struggled, and survived before them. Still, winter revealed truths people tried to avoid during warmer months. You learned who cracked under pressure, who rose to the challenge, who shared, who hoarded, who panicked and who planned. Winter wasn't just a season, it was a personality test, and it graded harshly. And then there was the darkest aspect of strained relationships, fantasizing about eating each other, not literally, well, hopefully not literally, but hunger, stress, and close quarters make the mind entertain dramatic thoughts. Someone stole your portion, you imagined smacking them with a wooden bowl, someone snored too loudly, you wondered what consequences you could face for silencing them. Someone criticized your fire tending, you pictured handing them the poker and seeing how well they did. Hunger didn't make you homicidal, just made you creative about solutions. But when the worst of winter passed, when sunlight returned, paths cleared, fresh food emerged, and the longhouse no longer felt like a claustrophobic emotional arena, you realized something important. You'd survived winter together. Your bonds were stretched, tested, frayed, repaired, strengthened and transformed. You couldn't have done it alone. None of you could. Because in medieval Scandinavia, you love them. You also consider eating them. In medieval Scandinavia, winter didn't just challenge life, it trimmed it. Death was not a dramatic visitor, not a thunderous event marked by screams or chaos. It came quietly like frost forming overnight. It arrived with the same inevitability as darkness, slipping through the longhouse door without knocking, taking its place beside the hearth as if it belonged there. And in a way it did. Winter made death part of the household. People didn't talk about it fearfully. They talked about it practically. In winter, mortality wasn't a possibility. It was an expectation. This wasn't fatalism, it was realism. Everyone understood the season's rules. You could do everything right, harvest well, store food carefully, keep the fire alive, tend your animals daily, mend your clothes, manage injuries, fight illness. And still lose someone. A bad turn in health, a sudden chill, an infection that grew stronger at night, or simply the slow erosion of a weakened body could shift a person from alive to gone with almost no warning. Winter didn't need drama. It had patience. Elderly family members were the most vulnerable. Age already taxed the body. Winter finished the job. An older person might go to sleep near the fire and never wake up. No one screamed. No one panicked. The family simply noticed the stillness in their breathing, the unusual quiet. They let the fire burn a little brighter that morning. They spoke softly. They accepted what had happened. Children were vulnerable too, fragile bodies fighting cold, illness, and hunger with less strength than adults. A child who grew too quiet, too pale, or too lethargic set off alarm bells that parents tried to silence with broth, warmth, and prayers. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. And when it didn't, the grief was heavy, but not surprising. Parents carried this knowledge constantly. Winter was not a neutral season. It was a judge who reviewed every weakness. Sometimes the cause of death was illness, a fever that raged too high, a cough that grew too deep, a sickness that settled into the chest and refused to leave. Winter illnesses were relentless. In warm seasons, fevers could break. In winter, fevers thrived. A person could deteriorate over days or suddenly worsen overnight when the cold was sharpest. Sometimes the cause was hunger, not dramatic starvation, just a gradual fading, a slow loss of energy, a step-by-step collapse. Someone who had eaten less so others could eat more. Someone whose body finally gave up. Hunger rarely took people in one violent moment. It whittled away at them until they slipped quietly into the season's statistics. Sometimes the cause was exposure, a misjudged trip outside, a fall in the snow, a person who stayed out too long tending animals or checking the roof. Exposure didn't always result in rescue. The cold could sap strength, steal consciousness, and turn a capable adult into a silent shape in the snow before anyone noticed. Sometimes the cause was injury, a slow infection from a winter accident, a wound that wouldn't heal, a cut that turned dark instead of pink. The body had less energy for healing when everything required effort just to maintain heat. Whatever the cause, winter deaths carried a particular stillness. They didn't come with violent scenes or cries for help. They arrived softly, and the household responded with a practiced blend of sadness and acceptance. Grief existed, of course, but grief in winter had limits. People couldn't afford to collapse under sorrow. There were chores to animals to feed, fires to tend, food to stretch a little further now that one more person wasn't eating. Survival didn't pause for mourning. Funerals in winter were simple, by necessity. The earth was frozen solid, impossible to dig without enormous labour. Families sometimes kept the body safely stored until spring thaw allowed burial. Other times they used communal burial mounds or dug shallow graves in softer ground near forests. Rituals continued, but they were stripped down. Words were spoken or respect was shown. But winter funerals were brief, because no one could stand still long without being chilled to the bone. And the emotional weight? People processed it differently than we do today. They didn't say, "Why did this happen?" They said, "Winter claimed another." They didn't say, "It's too soon." They said, "We feared it might be soon." They didn't say, "We can't go on." They said, "We must." Children grew up hearing stories of relatives who died last winter, or the winter before that, or 10 winters back. Loss became part of family identity. People remembered ancestors not by how they died, but by how they lived until winter took them. The river froze, the sun vanished, the cold strengthened, and someone would say, "This is the season when my grandfather passed," and life continued around that memory. Winter's power over life also reinforced spirituality, superstition, and ritual. People spoke of fate, omens, spirits, gods, ancestors. They sought meaning in signs because unpredictability demanded explanation. Death didn't terrify them so much as remind them this world is harsh, but we endure until we cannot. And when someone survived winter after losing loved ones, they carried that weight into spring, not broken but shaped. Winter changed grief from an emotional storm into a quiet, lifelong companion. Because in medieval Scandinavia, death didn't shock anyone. It just showed up on schedule. Spring in medieval Scandinavia wasn't a pastel greeting card. It wasn't birds chirping delicately or flowers bloom in polite unison. Spring, real spring, arrived like a debt collector. It didn't care that you survived winter. It came to calculate what that survival cost you. Because winter didn't simply end, it left a ledger. And spring's first task was to make you read it. When the snow melted, it didn't reveal green. It revealed consequences. The first thing you noticed wasn't beauty. It was damage. Roof beams warped from months of heavy snow. Fences half collapsed. Tools rusted from moisture and neglect. The yard looked like a battlefield fought between you, the weather, and time, and you definitely lost a few rounds. The longhouse exterior showed cracks where cold had forced timber apart. Doors didn't close right. Hinges sagged. Everything needed fixing immediately, and everyone was too exhausted to pretend otherwise. But you didn't get to ease into repairs. Spring wasn't patient. It presented you with a long list of chores that demanded urgent attention. Chores you couldn't postpone without ensuring next winter would be even worse. So you started with the most grim task of all, winter casualties. Animals that didn't make it through the cold lay stiff in barns or buried under snow that had finally begun to melt. Some had died quietly in the night. Others had succumbed to hunger. Others to sickness. Spring peeled back the white blanket and showed you exactly how many you lost. Chickens, sheep, goats, each death was a blow to your next year's survival plan. Every animal had a purpose, and losing even one messed up the math. Livestock that did survive were often thin, weak, and stressed. They needed feed you didn't have. They needed pasture that wasn't ready. They needed strength you couldn't give them yet. Spring confronted you with the uncomfortable truth. Surviving winter did not mean you were in good shape. It meant you limped into the next season with deficits. Then came the inventory. That moment when you emptied your storage and discovered the truth about your supplies. How much food was left? Usually not much, sometimes shockingly little. Occasionally none at all. Barrels that once held grain now scraped empty. The last of the dried fish rattled in sacks like loose bones. Smoked meat supplies looked pathetic. You'd been rationing, stretching, sacrificing, and spring forced you to admit how close you came to the line. Maybe you had enough food left for 2 weeks, maybe 3 days. Maybe it was gone entirely and you'd just started chewing through bark, flour, and desperation. And even though the sun was returning, fresh food was still a distant dream. Snowmelt didn't instantly create vegetables. You had weeks, sometimes months, before plants grew enough to feed anyone. Spring didn't feed you. It exposed how hungry you were. Next came repairs, the kind you postpone for 4 months because handling tools with numb fingers isn't ideal. Suddenly everything was urgent. Roof patches, barn walls, tools that needed replacing, carts with cracked wheels, sled runners splintered from overuse. Winter had treated your possessions like temporary suggestions. Spring demanded you put everything back together before the next season destroyed it again. But repairs required resources you didn't always have. Nails were scarce, timber had to be cut, rope needed twisting, tools had to be sharpened with stones worn almost smooth. Spring reminded you that winter didn't just break things, it used up the very materials you needed to fix them. Then came the ground itself, thawing, waterlogged and uncooperative. Snowmelt flooded fields, mud swallowed boots whole. The earth resembled thick porridge, making ploughing a torment. But if you didn't prepare your farmland early, you risked poor yields come harvest. And after winter, you couldn't afford anything less than a good harvest. So you pushed and slipped and strained against mud that clung to your legs like hungry spirits. And as for your own body, spring didn't let you ignore that either. Muscles weakened from rationing. Joints stiffened from cold. Sleep debt you'd accumulated all winter hit you like a hammer once the sun returned. You might not notice in winter how badly your body suffered, but spring made it obvious. Climbing ladders hurt, lifting loads hurt. Your hands trembled, your bones ached. Winter had drained you quietly, and spring's workload exposed every weakness you tried to hide. You also confronted the psychological cost, the winter grief you didn't have time for earlier. Spring thaw brought memory thaw. The places where someone used to sit, a mug that belonged to someone who didn't make it. The longhouse felt bigger now that death had removed bodies from the family cluster. You didn't talk about it much, but you felt it. Spring wasn't gentle. It forced you to face everything winter took. And still, there was no time to mourn properly. Chores pressed in from every direction. Life demanded urgency. Fields needed ploughing, animals needed grazing, new calves or kids needed care. The fishing season returned, trade routes reopened, neighbours emerged like ghosts blinking at sunlight, looking thin, tired and relieved. Spring gatherings weren't celebrations, they were status checks. Who survived? Who didn't? Who needed help? Who had enough strength left to provide it? You measured yourself against the faces around you and realised winter had carved everyone down like wood. People were paler, thinner, eyes more sunken, voices quieter. Survival wasn't triumph, it was resilience paid for in a physical and emotional debt. But spring wasn't cruel, it wasn't kind either. Spring was simply honest, it revealed what winter truly cost and then demanded you rebuild anyway. You didn't get to collapse in gratitude for making it through. You rolled up your sleeves, picked up your tools, and prepared for another year, because in medieval Scandinavia, you lived. Now deal with what it cost. When people today imagine medieval Scandinavia, They often picture heroic winter warriors, stoic figures striding through blizzards, wind whipping through fur cloaks, firelight gleaming off proud cheekbones. In reality, winter survival wasn't heroic, it wasn't cinematic, it wasn't even dignified. Winter survival was a grind, a long, monotonous, bone-deep battle of daily endurance that demanded persistence rather than glory. There was no victory moment. There was no triumphant conclusion. There was no single action that saved you. Winter survival was death by 1,000 chores, except reversed. Life by 1,000 chores. Life by 1,000 micro-decisions that were boring, repetitive, non-negotiable, and absolutely essential. You didn't wake up thinking, I shall defeat winter today. You woke up thinking, I hope doing everything I did yesterday again keeps us alive for one more day. Because every day of winter was composed of the same tasks repeated over and over. Fetch water, feed animals, mend clothes, maintain fire, ration food, check the roof, break ice, chop wood, scrape frozen muck off barn floors, and then do all of it again before bed. Nothing stayed done. Everything came undone by cold darkness and time. Endurance wasn't glamorous. It was slow, grinding work that made your back ache, your hands swell, and your mind slip into a strange rhythm somewhere between determination and numbness. Take the fire, for example. It wasn't a dramatic blaze of heroic warmth. It was a fragile, flickering flame that constantly needed babysitting. You didn't just light the fire once and enjoy it. You fed it every few hours, tended it carefully, protected it from sparks, coaxed it through nights, and used it sparingly to stretch your fuel as far as possible. Tending the fire wasn't bravery, it was maintenance. The animals didn't survive because you were powerful. They survived because you trudged through cold, darkness, and exhaustion every single day to keep them alive. You hauled gallons of water. You dragged hay bundles heavier than your entire personality. You scraped icy troughs and shoveled frozen manure, and did it while your nose ran, your fingers protested, and your joints begged for mercy. Fields weren't protected by strength, they were protected by decisions you made months earlier. Food wasn't preserved by heroism, it was preserved by hours spent smoking meat, drying fish, storing grain, checking containers, and rationing carefully enough that you didn't sabotage next week's meals. Even your clothing, your armor against winter, didn't protect you through force of will. It protected you because you fixed every tear, reinforced every seam, patched worn spots, and layered garments intelligently enough to delay frostbite. This wasn't the stuff sagas were made of. This was the stuff sagas carefully left out because it lacked dramatic flair. And that's exactly why winter survival was relentless. There was no break from it, no resting point, no moment where you could say, we've done enough today. Winter rewarded rest with consequences. Skipping a chore didn't delay it, it multiplied it. If you didn't chop wood today, you ran out tomorrow. If you didn't check the roof today, it collapsed in the next storm. If you didn't break the ice on the well, you went thirsty. If you didn't watch the fire, you froze during the night. Nothing in winter paused except daylight. And daylight paused too much. And then there was the psychological endurance. Not fear, not panic, not drama, just weariness. A long-term, slow-dripping exhaustion that seeped into your thoughts, your posture, your speech. You didn't cry dramatically about how hard winter was. You didn't have the energy. You didn't scream into the void. You saved your breath. You didn't brood over your suffering. You focused on the next task. Because brooding didn't feed the animals or keep the fire burning. Winter demanded emotional resilience long before that term existed. You had to master the art of accepting hardship without collapsing beneath it. You had to pace yourself physically and mentally. Too much effort too fast meant burnout, and burnout meant mistakes, and mistakes in winter often meant danger. Even hope required endurance. You had to remind yourself that the sun would come back, that the land would thaw, that the rivers would flow again, that the snow wouldn't last forever, because some days nothing about the world suggested that was true. And yet, through all of it, medieval Scandinavian families kept going. Not because they were stronger than the cold, not because they were fearless, Not because they performed epic feats of survival that earned them songs in a mead hall. They survived because they endured, steadily, stubbornly, quietly. Winter didn't demand heroes. It demanded people willing to lose the romance and keep the routine. People willing to push through boredom, fatigue, fear, anger, isolation and pain. People who understood that greatness wasn't required, only persistence. In the sagas, warriors conquered foes with steel and blood. In real life, farmers conquered winter with repetition and willpower. They didn't win, they didn't triumph, they didn't stand victorious on a snow-covered hill and proclaim victory. They simply outlasted winter long enough for spring to take over. Because in medieval Scandinavia, you didn't conquer winter, you outlasted it. After 23 chapters of unfiltered medieval misery, it's time for the real question, the one that's been quietly sitting behind every frostbitten moment, smoky longhouse scene, and desperate scramble for firewood. Could you survive a medieval Scandinavian winter? Let's be honest, modern humans like to imagine they could. We love the fantasy, we watch survival shows, we admire wool sweaters. We think eating dried fish for a season is a minor inconvenience. We see snowy landscapes and feel inspired, not alarmed. We sip hot chocolate by a window and tell ourselves, I could handle it. But medieval winter wasn't an aesthetic. It wasn't a vibe. It was a 24/7 survival gauntlet that required the physical stamina of an athlete, the mental toughness of a philosopher, the emotional endurance of a tired parent, and the practical skills of someone who could turn a frozen goat bladder into a waterproof pouch before breakfast. So let's compare. Modern expectations. I'll bundle up and stay warm. Medieval reality. Layering wasn't about looking cute. It was about preventing your body from slowly giving up on you. Your clothing smelled like smoke, livestock, and existential despair. Wool itched, fur shed, linen froze, and every layer weighed as much as your unspoken regrets. You didn't bundle up. You assembled armour. Modern expectations. I'll drink lots of warm beverages. Medieval reality. Water fought you. Every step of the way, it froze in buckets, it froze in wells, it froze in the ladle between scoops. Hot drinks were a luxury you earned by hauling wood, breaking ice, and coaxing fur like it was a temperamental deity. Your tea didn't steep. Your tea solidified. Modern expectations. I'll stay inside where it's cozy. Medieval reality. Nothing was cozy, not even slightly. Inside the longhouse, the fire smoked your eyes into submission. Drafts sneaked in from every direction. You shared the space with animals, noisy children, the smell of boiled fish, and the sounds of winter gnawing at the walls. You didn't curl up with a blanket, you curled up with survival anxiety. Cozy wasn't invented yet, only less miserable than outside. Modern expectations. I'll try homesteading. It sounds peaceful. Medieval reality. Peaceful. Winter farming was a horror anthology written by nature. You chopped wood until your hands shook. You carried water until your shoulders collapsed. You repaired tools with numb fingers. You fed livestock that judged you for being slow. You lived in constant fear of storms, predators, and your barn collapsing under snow. Homesteading wasn't peaceful, it was cardio. Modern expectations. I'll just work really hard. Medieval reality. You will. And it won't matter. Winter didn't reward effort. It rewarded preparation, luck, community, and the ability to endure months of repetitive misery without collapsing into a snowbank. Hard work was the starting point. Survival required more. Modern expectations. I'll stay positive. Medieval reality. Positivity didn't warm your hands, it didn't fill your stomach, it didn't stop frostbite, it didn't repair the roof, it didn't keep wolves away. Winter didn't care about your attitude. Winter wanted results. The real test you'd need, the strength to haul water, wood, and hay daily. The skill to maintain a fire with limited fuel, the resilience to work in darkness, the patience to live with your entire family in one smoky room, the practicality to ration food without losing your mind, the awareness to avoid deadly slips, the discipline to do every necessary task exactly when it needed doing, the emotional strength to endure illness, death, isolation and fear. You'd also need to understand animals, weather patterns, tool repair, basic medicine, superstition-based risk management, and how to identify ice that could trap you in a frozen grave. And then there's the mental shift. Modern humans crave comfort. Medieval winter didn't offer comfort. It offered survival and the satisfaction of not dying that day. If you lived through a medieval winter, it wasn't because you were heroic. It was because you adapted to misery so thoroughly it stopped bothering you. You didn't conquer the cold, you negotiated with it. You didn't fight the dark. You learned to live inside it. You didn't rise above the season. You endured it, slowly, stubbornly, unglamorously. And if you made it to spring, blinking like a creature emerging from hibernation, badly underweight, mentally exhausted and spiritually questionable, people wouldn't throw a feast in your honor. They'd nod and say, "Good, now let's get ready for next winter." Because the final joke of medieval Scandinavian life was this: the good news, you survived the winter. The bad news, you have to do it again next year.